Hi everyone, welcome to East Park. I hope you're all doing well. Today I want to argue that South Park's approach to religion is not about attacking faith itself, but about exposing how people use religion, whether that's through hypocrisy, commercialization, dogmatic conflict, or institutional power. By examining how the show satirizes Christianity, Judaism, Mormonism, Scientology, atheism, and religious conflict in general, we can see that South Park targets human behavior around belief systems rather than the beliefs themselves. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. Early satire, religion, and everyday belief. When South Park first appeared on television in 1997, it quickly became clear that creators Trey Parker and Matt Stone were willing to make fun of anything and everything in American culture. Religion was no exception to this approach. From the very beginning of the show, churches, religious rituals, and faith appeared as natural parts of life in the fictional Colorado town of South Park. The characters attended church services on Sundays, celebrated religious holidays throughout the year, and referenced God and Jesus in their daily conversations, just like people in many American small towns do. Religious practice was woven into the fabric of the community in ways that felt familiar and recognizable. However, the way the show portrayed these religious elements revealed something interesting and important about its approach to satire. South Park was not interested in preaching atheism or promoting any particular religious view as the correct one. The show was not trying to convince viewers to abandon faith or to adopt faith. Instead, the creators focused on how people actually practiced their faith in everyday life, often pointing out the gap between what people claimed to believe and how they actually behaved when those beliefs were tested or when following them became inconvenient. In the early seasons, religion appeared as background texture in many episodes without necessarily being the main focus of the entire story. The boys would mention going to church as something they did on Sunday mornings. Their parents would reference Catholic or Protestant traditions during conversations about holidays or moral questions. Father Maxey, the town's Catholic priest, would appear in various episodes as a recurring character who represented institutional religion in the community. These early appearances established that South Park existed in a world where religion was present and normal, just like in most American small towns. The show did not treat religion as something strange or foreign that needed extensive explanation for viewers to understand. However, even in these early background appearances, the show began developing its satirical approach to religious practice. When characters went to church in these episodes, the show often depicted them sitting through boring sermons while thinking about completely unrelated topics or planning what they would do after the service ended. When they prayed, the prayers were usually selfish requests for personal benefits like winning the lottery or getting revenge on someone they dislike, rather than expressions of genuine spirituality or a concern for others. When they invoked God or religious authority in arguments or decisions, it was often to justify something they wanted to do anyway, rather than to actually follow religious teachings that might require them to change their behavior or make sacrifices. These small moments and details established a pattern that would continue throughout the entire series over many years and hundreds of episodes. South Park was interested in the reality of how people practiced religion in their actual daily lives, rather than the idealized version that religious institutions presented in their official teachings or public statements. The show examined what religion looked like when it encountered real human selfishness, laziness, hypocrisy, and fear. From season 3 provides a clear and detailed example of how the show used religious satire in its early years. This episode aired in April 1999 and dealt with a bizarre phenomenon where people in South Park kept spontaneously bursting into flames for no apparent reason that anyone could identify. The townspeople became terrified and desperate to understand why this was happening to members of their community and how to prevent it from happening to them or their loved ones. They turned to their religious leaders for guidance and explanation, which was a natural response for a community facing something they could not explain through normal scientific means or common sense. The episode showed the town's response to the crisis evolving through different stages that satirized various aspects of religious practice and institutional religion's role in community life. Initially, people tried to understand the spontaneous combustion through scientific investigation. They brought in experts, conducted tests, and tried to find rational explanations for why human bodies would suddenly ignite. When science could not provide immediate answers or solutions to the problem, the community turned to religion for comfort, reassurance, and explanation. This shift from science to religion happened naturally in the story because people were scared and needed to feel like someone understood what was happening. Father Maxey, the Catholic priest, held special services and led the community in prayer during this crisis. The episode depicted the congregation attending these services regularly and faithfully, seeking reassurance from their priest and divine intervention from God to stop the spontaneous spontaneous combustions. The church became the center of community life during this frightening time, which reflected how religious institutions often become more important to people during crises or disasters when normal life feels threatened. However, the way the show portrayed these religious gatherings revealed its satirical intent and its critique of how religion sometimes functions in communities. The people filling the church pews were not particularly focused on spiritual growth, moral improvement, or becoming better people through their faith. They were focused entirely on their fear of burning up and their desperate desire to avoid that terrible fate. Their religious practice during this crisis was driven completely by self-interest and terror rather than by genuine faith, devotion, or spiritual seeking. The prayers they offered were essentially bargains with God, promising to be better people or to follow religious rules more carefully if God would just prevent them from spontaneously combusting. As the crisis continued without resolution, Father Maxey began promoting a specific theory about why the combustions were happening to people in the town. He suggested that the phenomenon was God's punishment for sin, particularly sexual sin and improper thoughts or desires. This interpretation led to an escalating series of prohibitions and guilt-inducing sermons about proper behavior and the importance of avoiding sin. The townspeople responded to these sermons by becoming increasingly anxious and fearful about their personal conduct, worrying that any pleasure or enjoyment they experienced might be the sin that would cause them to burst into flames. The episode showed how this religious interpretation of the crisis led to absurd and harmful consequences for individuals and for the community as a whole. People became afraid of normal human activities and natural bodily functions. They developed elaborate rules and rituals designed to prevent combustion through perfect obedience to religious law and complete avoidance of anything that might be considered sinful. The community's religious response to the crisis, rather than providing genuine comfort or actual solutions to the problem, created additional anxiety and made people's lives significantly worse. Everyone was walking on eggshells, terrified that any small mistake or natural human impulse would result in their death. The satire here was not aimed at the existence of God or the validity of religious belief in general. The show was not making an argument that religion itself was bad or that faith was stupid. Instead, the satire was aimed at how religious institutions sometimes use fear to control people's behavior, and how communities can become obsessed with rules, punishment, and avoiding divine wrath rather than focusing on genuine spirituality, helping each other, or addressing practical problems. The episode demonstrated how religion could make a bad situation worse when it was applied in ways that increased fear rather than providing real comfort or wisdom. The resolution of the episode came not through religious revelation or divine intervention, but through scientific understanding and common sense. Randy Marsh, Stan's father who worked as a geologist, eventually figured out that the spontaneous combustions were caused by a buildup of methane gas in people's bodies. This buildup occurred because people were refusing to pass gas because they thought bodily functions were sinful and disgusting. The problem was solved by people simply accepting that normal bodily functions were natural parts of being human and not sinful acts that would anger God. The religious anxiety that had gripped the town turned out to be making the problem worse rather than better. This resolution demonstrated South Park's approach to religious satire in its early years. The show was not saying that God did not exist or that religion was inherently bad or harmful. It was saying that sometimes religious communities focus on the wrong things, create unnecessary guilt and fear around natural aspects of human life, and miss simple practical solutions to problems by being too caught up in spiritual interpretations and supernatural explanations. The satire targeted the behavior of religious practitioners and institutions rather than attacking the concept of faith itself. Another aspect of early South Park's religious satire appeared in how the show portrayed church attendance as primarily a social obligation rather than a spiritual practice that people genuinely valued. In multiple episodes across the early seasons, characters would reference going to church on Sunday as something they had to do because it was expected by the community, not because they wanted to attend or because they found the services meaningful or enriching. The boys would complain about having to sit through boring sermons when they would rather be playing or watching television. Their parents would attend church services while clearly thinking about other things, such as work problems or neighborhood gossip, rather than paying attention to the religious content being presented. The show also established early on that many characters claimed to be religious and identified as Christian, but did not actually follow the moral teachings of their faith in their daily lives and interactions with others. People who sat quietly in church on Sunday morning would engage engage in cruel gossip about their neighbors, selfish behavior toward their families, and various forms of hypocrisy throughout the rest of the week. They would invoke God's authority when it suited their purposes or helped them win arguments, but they would ignore religious teachings about compassion, forgiveness, and helping the poor when those teachings were inconvenient or would require actual personal sacrifice. This pattern of showing a significant gap between claimed belief and actual practice became one of South Park's most consistent approaches to religious satire throughout its entire run. The show repeatedly demonstrated through various storylines that many people used religion as a social identity marker or a source of personal comfort without letting it actually change how they treated others or how they made important decisions. They wanted the benefits of belonging to a religious community and the reassurance of believing in a higher power, but they did not want to do the difficult work of actually living according to religious principles that might require them to change their behavior or give up things they enjoyed. The early seasons also began exploring how different religious groups within the same community often failed to get along with each other despite supposedly sharing core values about love, compassion, charity, and treating others well. Catholics and Protestants in South Park would sometimes clash over minor theological differences while completely ignoring their shared beliefs and common ground. Religious people would look down on those who were not religious or who belonged to different faiths, treating them as inferior or misguided. The show used these conflicts to point out how religion could divide communities and create hostility rather than unite people around shared values, even when the actual teachings of different Christian denominations had enormous overlap and similarity. Father Maxey, as a recurring character representing institutional religion throughout the series, was often portrayed sympathetically, even when the show was satirizing religious practice or church hierarchy. He genuinely cared about his congregation and tried to help people with their problems. However, he was also shown as sometimes being out of touch with the real problems people faced, too focused on abstract theology when people needed practical help or emotional support, or complicit in institutional problems like the Catholic Church's various scandals. The show's treatment of Father Maxey demonstrated that South Park could be critical of religious institutions and their failures, while still acknowledging that individual religious leaders often had good intentions and tried to do right by their communities. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These early episodes set the foundation for how South Park would approach religion throughout its long run, leading directly to episodes that centered entire storylines around specific faith traditions and their practices. Section 2. Judaism in South Park. Kyle Broflovsky, one of the four main characters in South Park, is Jewish. This fundamental fact about his identity was established in the very first episode of the series, and remained a consistent and important part of his character throughout the entire run of the show, spanning more than 2 decades. Kyle's Jewish identity gave the show a natural and organic way to explore Judaism and Jewish culture through storylines, character interactions, and conflicts that arose from his being different from most other residents of the town. Unlike some aspects of characters that the show would exaggerate wildly or change completely for comedic effect, Kyle's Judaism remained a serious and genuine part of who he was as a person. The show used this aspect of his character to create both comedy and more thoughtful commentary about religious identity, tradition, minority experiences, and how minority religious communities function in predominantly Christian environments. From the very beginning of the series, the show acknowledged openly that being Jewish in South Park made Kyle different from most other residents of the town in meaningful ways. The majority of the town's population celebrated Christian holidays like Christmas and Easter, attended Christian churches on Sunday mornings, and participated in Christian cultural traditions throughout the year. Kyle's family celebrated different holidays like Hanukkah and Passover, attended synagogue instead of church, and followed different traditions and customs that were not familiar to most of their neighbors. The show did not treat this difference as something wrong, shameful, or strange that needed to be hidden or apologized for. Instead, it treated Kyle's Jewish identity as simply a fact about him, similar to how Stan's parents were divorced, or how Cartman's family situation was complicated and unusual. Kyle was Jewish in the same fundamental way that other characters had defining characteristics that shaped their experiences and perspectives. However, Kyle's Judaism also became a frequent and consistent target for Eric Cartman's cruel jokes, insults, and harassment throughout the entire series. Cartman would regularly make anti-Semitic comments directed specifically at Kyle, Kyle, use Jewish stereotypes as weapons in arguments, reference conspiracy theories about Jewish people controlling the world, and generally harass Kyle about his religious identity in ways that were deeply offensive and hurtful. These moments were clearly meant to show Cartman as a terrible person with serious character flaws, rather than to actually promote or endorse anti-Semitic views. The show used Cartman's bigotry and hatred to satirize prejudice and to demonstrate how ignorant and hateful people actually think, talk, and justify their beliefs. Kyle would respond to Cartman's insults with frustration, anger, and sometimes hurt, showing that the prejudice caused real emotional pain even though it came from someone Kyle knew was an idiot and a bad person. This ongoing dynamic between Kyle and Cartman created a context where Judaism appeared regularly throughout the series, even in episodes that were not specifically focused on religion as their main topic. Kyle's Jewish identity was not something that only mattered in special holiday episodes, or in very special episodes specifically about religious themes. It was part of his daily experience of life and part of how other characters related to him and understood who he was. This made South Park's portrayal of Judaism feel more integrated and realistic compared to many other television shows where minority religious identities only appear occasionally in very special episodes specifically designed to teach viewers about that religion. The show also explored how Kyle's family practiced Judaism in their home and daily lives. His mother Sheila was often portrayed as particularly protective of Jewish identity and culture, sometimes to the point of becoming overly aggressive in defending what she perceived as threats to Jewish interests or Jewish people. She would become involved in various campaigns and causes throughout the series, occasionally invoking Jewish values or Jewish community concerns to justify her actions and positions. The show used these moments to explore how religious and cultural identity could become wrapped up in broader social and political issues. Kyle's father, Gerald, was portrayed as more relaxed in his approach to Judaism compared to Sheila, though he still maintained Jewish traditions and passed them on to his children. The difference between how Sheila and Gerald approached their Jewish identity showed that even within the same family, people could have different levels of religious observance and different ideas about what being Jewish meant. This nuance prevented the show from suggesting that all Jewish people practiced their faith in exactly the same way or had identical relationships with their religious heritage. __quote_1__ from season 3 represents South Park's first major episode centered specifically on Jewish traditions, community, and religious practice. The episode aired in July 1999 and focused on Kyle and his younger brother Ike attending a Jewish scout camp called Jew Scouts, which was similar in concept to Christian scout camps like the one mentioned in other episodes of the series. Kenny, who is not Jewish, comes along with them to participate in the camp activities as Kyle's friend. The episode's basic setup immediately established that Jewish communities had their own parallel institutions and traditions that served similar social and educational functions to Christian equivalents that were more familiar to most American viewers. The camp in Jubilee was portrayed as having many similarities to any other summer camp that children might attend. The boys participated in typical camp activities like canoeing on the lake, arts and crafts projects, singing songs around campfires, and competing in various games and challenges. However, the camp also included specifically Jewish elements woven throughout the activities, such as learning about Jewish history and the stories of important figures, practicing Hebrew language skills, studying Torah passages, and preparing for religious ceremonies that would take place during their time at camp. The episode showed Jewish tradition and practice as something that could be fun and engaging for children, rather than just as boring obligations, restrictive rules, or things they had to do because their parents made them. The camp counselors in the episode were shown teaching the boys about Jewish heritage with enthusiasm and dedication. They organized activities that connected Jewish religious teachings to practical lessons about cooperation, responsibility, and community. The episode depicted the camp as a place where Jewish children could feel comfortable being themselves, where their religious identity was the norm rather than something that made them different or unusual. This aspect of the episode reflected a real function that religious camps serve for minority communities, providing spaces where children from those communities can be surrounded by others who share their background and traditions. The central plot of Jubilee involved the campers preparing for and participating in a special ceremony to summon Moses, who is one of the most important figures in Jewish history and religion. In the South Park universe as presented in this episode, Moses was portrayed as a giant spinning dreidel-shaped being with glowing lights, mysterious powers, and a booming voice that echoed across the camp. This absurd visual representation was clearly meant to be funny and irreverent in typical South Park fashion. However, the episode's treatment of Moses and the ceremony surrounding his summoning was not mean-spirited or cruel toward Judaism itself as a religion or toward Jewish people. Instead, it created a fantastical and entertaining version of Jewish tradition that acknowledged the sacred importance and historical significance of Moses, while also making him visually ridiculous in a way that was funny and memorable. The ceremony to summon Moses required the campers to work together cooperatively, follow specific ritual steps in the correct order, and demonstrate their knowledge of Jewish tradition, history, and religious practice. The episode showed the boys taking this ceremony seriously and treating it as important, even though the actual visual representation of Moses was absurd and silly. They understood that this ceremony mattered deeply to their community and their religious identity as Jewish people. The episode managed to balance humor with a kind of genuine respect for the idea that religious rituals and traditions created meaning, connection, and continuity for the people who participated in them and passed them down through generations. The main conflict and dramatic tension in Quote 4 came from an antagonist character named Garth, who wanted to summon Haman instead of Moses, and use Haman's evil power for his own wicked purposes. Haman, in actual Jewish tradition and scripture, was the villain in the Purim story who tried to destroy the Jewish people, but was ultimately defeated by Queen Esther and her uncle Mordecai. The episode used this real historical and religious figure from Jewish scripture as the basis for its villain, showing that the writers had done at least some research and had some knowledge of actual Jewish stories, history, and religious texts, rather than just making things up randomly. Garth's evil plan to summon Haman created real stakes and tension in the episode, while also allowing for action and adventure elements that made the story more exciting and engaging. The boys had to work together to stop Garth's scheme, protect the camp and their fellow campers, and ensure that the proper ceremony to summon Moses could proceed as planned. This gave the episode a clear structure with heroes and villains, challenges to overcome, and a satisfying resolution where good triumphed over evil. Kenny, as the non-Jewish character attending the camp alongside his Jewish friend Kyle, served as an audience surrogate who learned about Jewish traditions alongside viewers who might not be familiar with them or who had never encountered Jewish religious practice before. Through Kenny's experience of participating in camp activities and asking questions about things he did not understand, the episode explained various aspects of Jewish practice and belief in ways that were accessible and understandable for viewers. Kenny participated fully in the activities, learned the songs and stories, made friends with the other campers, and helped save the camp from Garth's evil plan. His inclusion in the story showed that Jewish traditions were not exclusive, secretive, or impossible for outsiders to understand and appreciate if they approach them with openness and respect. Kenny's positive experience at the Jewish camp also demonstrated that religious and cultural differences did not have to create barriers between friends. He remained close with Kyle throughout the experience and gained appreciation for traditions that were different from his own background. This aspect of the episode carried a gentle message about tolerance and understanding without being preachy or heavy-handed about it. The resolution of __quote_5__ involved the boys successfully completing the proper ceremony and summoning Moses, who then helped them defeat Haman and stop Garth's evil scheme. Moses was portrayed as powerful, wise, protective of the Jewish children at the camp, and committed to preserving Jewish tradition and community. Despite his ridiculous appearance as a giant glowing dreidel with lights and a booming voice, he functioned in the story as a benevolent force who genuinely cared about the welfare of the Jewish community and wanted to ensure that their traditions continued. The episode ended with the camp successfully completing their ceremony, the boys having learned more about their religious heritage and identity, and everyone safe from the threat that Garth had posed. What made Jubilee particularly significant in South Park's overall treatment of religion was how it managed to balance irreverent humor with genuine affection for the subject matter. The episode clearly made fun of certain aspects of Jewish tradition, particularly through the absurd visual representation of Moses and some of the more unusual ritual elements it invented or exaggerated for comedic effect. However, the episode also showed Jewish community, tradition, and religious practice as sources of meaning, connection, positive identity, and continuity for the characters involved. The episode never suggested that Jewish beliefs were foolish or that Jewish people were wrong to maintain their traditions and pass them down to younger generations. Kyle's Jewish identity continued to be relevant and important throughout the series in ways both serious and comedic across hundreds of episodes over more than 20 years. In some episodes, his Judaism would be mentioned casually in passing as part of explaining explaining why he did or did not participate in certain activities or celebrations. In other episodes, it would become more central to the plot and the main focus of the story, such as when the show dealt with Christmas celebrations in the town and Kyle's family celebrated Hanukkah instead, creating situations where Kyle felt left out or different from his friends. The show developed a nuanced portrayal where Kyle was proud of his Jewish heritage and took it seriously as an important part of his identity, but was also sometimes frustrated by how it made him different from his friends or made him a target for Cartman's abuse and harassment. The show also occasionally featured other Jewish characters beyond Kyle's immediate family, showing different ways that people practiced and understood Judaism. Some characters were more religiously observant than Kyle's family, while others were more secular and cultural in their Jewish identity. This variety in representation prevented the show from suggesting that there was only one correct way to be Jewish, or that all Jewish people thought and acted identically. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The show's playful engagement with Judaism provided a foundation for exploring Christianity, where the satire would become sharper and the targets more varied as South Park examined the dominant religion in American culture. Section 3. Christianity Parody and Commentary. South Park's treatment of Christianity became more focused and direct as the show progressed beyond its early seasons. While the early episodes included Christianity as background texture and occasionally satirized church attendance or religious hypocrisy, later episodes devoted entire storylines to examining specific aspects of Christian practice, belief, and culture. The show began to explore how Christianity interacted with modern American life, particularly how faith could become commercialized, how religious symbols and stories functioned in popular culture, and how Christian identity shaped communities and individuals. The satire became sharper and more specific, targeting particular phenomena within Christian culture rather than just making general observations about religion. __quote_7__ from season 7 aired in October 2003 and represents one of South Park's most direct satirical examinations of how Christianity intersects with commercial entertainment and pop culture. The episode began with Cartman trying to convince Stan, Kyle, and Kenny that they should start a rock band together. The other boys were skeptical because none of them really knew how to play instruments very well, and they had no experience performing music. Cartman insisted they could become famous and make lots of money by forming a band, appealing to their desire for success and recognition. However, the other boys quickly became frustrated with Cartman's attitude and approach to the band. Cartman wanted to be in charge of everything, wanted credit for all the ideas, and refused to listen to anyone else's input or suggestions. This led to arguments and conflicts within the group. Eventually, Kyle made a bet with Cartman about who could get a platinum record first. Kyle would stay with Stan and Kenny in their regular rock band, while Cartman would have to form his own band and compete against them. The bet created the central conflict that drove the rest of the episode. After the bet was made, Cartman had to figure out how to form a successful band on his own. He realized that breaking into the regular rock music industry would be difficult and competitive. While thinking about easier paths to musical success, Cartman had an idea that forms the core of the episode's satire. He decided to form a Christian rock band instead of a regular rock band. His reasoning was purely commercial and cynical. He believed that Christian rock would be easier because the standards were lower, the competition was less intense, and Christian audiences would buy albums simply because they had religious content regardless of actual musical quality. Cartman recruited Token and Butters to be in his Christian rock band, even though neither of them had any particular interest in Christian music or strong Christian faith. Token could play bass guitar, which gave the band some actual musical ability. Butters was just eager to be included and would do whatever Cartman told him to do. Cartman named the band __quote_8__ and began writing Christian rock songs using a very simple formula that the episode presents as satire of the genre. The episode showed Cartman's songwriting process in detail to make its satirical point about commercialization of faith. Cartman would take regular love songs that already existed and simply replace words like baby or references to romantic partners with Jesus or Lord. The melodies, structures, and emotional content of the songs remained exactly the same as secular love songs. Only the object of affection changed from a human romantic partner to Jesus Christ. This simple word substitution was presented as all that was required to transform a secular song into a Christian rock song that would appeal to religious audiences. The satire here targeted how some Christian rock music appropriates the styles, sounds, and structures of secular popular music, while simply adding religious lyrics on top. The episode suggested that this approach was not genuinely spiritual or creative, but rather was a commercial strategy to sell products to a religious market. The songs that Faith Plus One performed in the episode sounded exactly like typical pop and rock love songs, complete with emotional intensity and romantic imagery, but directed toward Jesus rather than toward a human being. This created an uncomfortable and often unintentionally suggestive quality to the lyrics that the episode played for comedy. Meanwhile, Stan and Kyle's regular rock band struggled to make any progress in the competitive music industry. They could not get record deals, could not get their music heard by important people, and faced constant rejection. This parallel storyline emphasized how difficult the regular music industry was compared to the Christian rock market that Cartman was exploiting. The episode presented the mainstream music industry as requiring genuine talent, originality, and persistence, while suggesting that Christian rock required only the willingness to pander to religious audiences with shallow, derivative content. Faith Plus One became remarkably successful within the Christian rock market. The band's albums sold well, they performed at Christian music festivals, and they built a devoted following among Christian audiences who appreciated their religious-themed music. Cartman achieved the commercial success he wanted by exploiting religious sentiment and commercializing faith. However, the episode revealed that Christian rock albums used a different certification system than regular rock albums. While regular albums could achieve platinum status by selling a certain number of copies, Christian albums received different awards that were not equivalent to platinum records in the mainstream music industry. When Cartman discovered this difference in how Christian albums were certified, he became furious and felt cheated. The bet he had made with Kyle was specifically about getting a platinum record, and Christian albums could not technically achieve platinum certification in the same way that mainstream albums could. All of Cartman's success in the Christian rock market turned out to be meaningless for the purposes of winning the bet. This revelation led to the episode's climax, where Cartman had a complete meltdown on stage during a Christian Music Awards ceremony. Cartman's breakdown involved him cursing, destroying the award he had just received, and revealing to the Christian audience that he had never actually cared about Jesus or Christianity at all. He admitted openly that he had only formed a Christian rock band to make money and win a bet. He had been cynically exploiting Christian audiences the entire time. This confession destroyed Faith Plus One's career and reputation in the Christian music community. The episode ended with Cartman having achieved commercial success, but ultimately losing the bet with Kyle because Christian platinum records did not count as real platinum records. The satire in Christian rock hard operated on multiple levels. On the surface, it mocked Christian rock music for being derivative, formulaic, and commercially motivated rather than genuinely spiritual. The episode suggested that much Christian rock was simply secular music with Jesus references added, created to sell products to religious consumers rather than to express authentic faith or create genuinely good music. On a deeper level, the episode examined how faith could be commercialized and turned into a consumer product, how religious audiences could be targeted and exploited by people who did not share their beliefs, and how the separation between sacred and secular entertainment had become blurred in modern American culture. The episode also satirized how Christian culture had developed its own parallel entertainment industry that mimicked secular entertainment while claiming to be different and better because of its religious content. The Christian Music Awards, Christian music charts, and Christian music festivals shown in the episode were presented as attempts to create a separate Christian version of mainstream entertainment culture rather than as something genuinely distinct or spiritually meaningful. The satire suggested that this separation often resulted in lower quality products that succeeded primarily because they appealed to a captive religious market rather than because they were actually good. Fantastic Easter Special from season 11 aired in April 2007 and took a very different approach to Christian satire. While Christian Rock Hard focused on commercial exploitation of Christian culture, Fantastic Easter Special engaged with Christian religious tradition, symbolism, and mythology in a more elaborate and fantastical way. The episode aired during the Easter season and dealt directly with Easter traditions, symbols, and the religious significance of the holiday. The episode began with the town of South Park celebrating Easter with typical activities like Easter egg hunts and visits from the Easter Bunny. However, Stan became curious about why these traditions existed and what they actually meant. He asked his father Randy to explain the connection between Easter eggs, the Easter Bunny, and the religious aspects of Easter related to Jesus Christ's resurrection. Randy's explanations were vague and unsatisfying, revealing that he participated in Easter traditions without really understanding their origins or significance. Stan's investigation into Easter led him into an elaborate conspiracy involving secret societies, hidden history, and powerful organizations organizations trying to suppress the truth about Easter's origins and meaning. The episode created a complex mythology, borrowing elements from conspiracy thriller stories and blending them with Christian religious imagery and Easter symbolism. Stan discovered that there was a secret society of rabbits who had been present at Jesus Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, and that these rabbits had been protecting and preserving the true meaning of Easter throughout history. The episode presented Jesus Christ as an actual character who appeared and interacted with Stan and other characters. Jesus was portrayed as a competent action hero who could fight and use weapons, very different from traditional reverent depictions of Jesus in religious art and media. The episode showed Jesus working with the secret rabbit society to protect Easter traditions and to prevent evil forces from corrupting or destroying the holiday's true meaning. This treatment of Jesus as an action hero, rather than as a solemn religious figure, was characteristic of South Park's irreverent approach to sacred subjects. The conspiracy at the heart of Quote 16 involved the Vatican and the Catholic Church hierarchy trying to suppress the true story of Easter and to hide the role that rabbits had played in Christian history. The episode suggested that the church had political and institutional reasons for controlling religious narratives and for determining which traditions were considered acceptable and which were suppressed. This aspect of the episode connected Easter mythology to broader critiques of religious institutional power and control over religious knowledge. The episode climaxed with Stan and Jesus working together to defeat the conspiracy and to ensure that the true meaning of Easter could be preserved and passed down. The resolution involved revealing the secret history of rabbits in Christianity and establishing that Easter eggs and the Easter Bunny had legitimate connections to the resurrection story rather than being random pagan traditions that had been awkwardly attached to a Christian holiday. The episode created its own mythology, explaining these connections in ways that were obviously fictional and absurd, but that served to comment on how religious traditions evolve, combine, and take on meanings that may be very different from their origins. __quote_17__ functioned as satire through its treatment of religious mythology and tradition. The episode took Christian Easter traditions seriously enough to build an entire elaborate story around them, but it also made those traditions ridiculous through exaggeration and by blending them with conspiracy thriller elements. The episode poked fun at how religious stories and traditions can seem strange or arbitrary when examined closely, particularly when trying to understand how various cultural practices became associated with religious holidays. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Christian satire in South Park evolved from these specific examinations into broader explorations of organized religion and institutional power, particularly focusing on the Catholic Church's unique position and historical controversies. Section 4. Catholicism and Institutional Satire. While South Park satirized Christianity broadly through episodes like Quote 18 and Quote 19, the show also targeted the Catholic Church specifically as an institution with unique characteristics, historical controversies, and hierarchical structures that made it a particularly rich subject for satire. The Catholic Church, as one of the oldest and largest religious institutions in the world, has a complex history involving political power, theological authority, elaborate rituals, and various scandals that have emerged over centuries. South Park approached Catholic-specific satire with particular attention to institutional problems, clerical authority, and the gap between the church's moral teachings and the actual behavior of some church officials and the institutional responses to those failures. Red Hot Catholic Love from Season 6 aired in July 2002 and became one of South Park's most controversial episodes dealing with religion during the show's entire run. The episode addressed the Catholic Church's abuse scandals that had been receiving significant news coverage and public attention in the early 2000s, particularly following extensive investigative reporting by major newspapers that revealed the scope of abuse and institutional cover-ups. These real-world scandals involved numerous cases of Catholic priests abusing children and teenagers under their pastoral care, followed by institutional cover-ups where church hierarchy moved abusive priests to different parishes rather than reporting them to legal authorities or removing them from positions where they had access to vulnerable children. The episode began with the people of South Park becoming aware of the abuse scandals through news reports that were broadcasting stories about the Catholic Church's problems. Parents in the town became deeply concerned about whether their own children were safe in the Catholic Church, and whether local priests might pose dangers to the community's young people. This setup immediately established that the episode would be dealing with serious, disturbing, and sensitive subject matter, though it would address these issues through the lens of satire and dark comedy that characterized South Park's approach to difficult topics that other shows might avoid entirely. Father Maxey, the local Catholic priest who had appeared in many previous episodes as a generally well-meaning, if sometimes misguided religious leader, was shown as genuinely horrified and deeply upset by the abuse scandals, and absolutely determined to address the problem directly. He was portrayed as having had no knowledge of the widespread nature of the abuse within the church, and as being shocked that such terrible things had been happening while church leadership had failed to stop them or to protect victims. Father Maxey decided to travel all the way to the Vatican in Rome to confront church leadership directly, and to demand that they take meaningful action to stop the abuse, to remove priests who had harmed children, and to reform church practices to prevent future abuse. This decision to make Father Maxey the protagonist fighting against church corruption showed that the episode's satire was directed specifically at institutional problems, hierarchical cover-ups, and the failures of church leadership, rather than at all priests individually, or at Catholic faith and theology itself. Father Maxey represented what the episode presented as the authentic religious calling, to protect the vulnerable, and to uphold moral principles even when doing so meant challenging powerful institutions and authorities. Father Maxey's journey to the Vatican allowed the episode to depict the Catholic Church hierarchy as remote, out of touch with ordinary believers in parish life, and more concerned with protecting the institution's reputation and power than with addressing serious moral problems or protecting victims of abuse. When Father Maxey arrived at the Vatican after traveling across the ocean and attempted to speak with church officials about the abuse scandals and the urgent need for reform, he was repeatedly ignored, dismissed, or told that the matter was not his concern and that he should return to his parish and let higher authorities handle the situation. The Vatican officials were portrayed as caring primarily about maintaining traditional practices, preserving ancient rituals exactly as they had been performed for centuries, and preserving their own authority and positions within the church hierarchy, rather than responding to the serious moral crisis facing the church in the modern world. The episode suggested that these officials had become so disconnected from the actual communities and people they were supposed to serve that they could not or would not recognize the urgency of problems affecting ordinary believers and their children. The episode included an extended sequence showing a formal meeting of Catholic officials in an ornate room within the Vatican, where they discussed how to respond to the abuse scandals that were damaging the church's reputation around the world. Rather than focusing on how to protect children, how to support victims, how to hold abusive priests accountable, or how to reform church practices to prevent future abuse, the officials were shown debating obscure theological and liturgical questions that had absolutely no relevance to the actual problem at hand. They argued about minor details of religious ritual, about the proper interpretation of ancient church documents, and about procedural matters while completely avoiding and ignoring the urgent moral and practical issues that Father Maxey had traveled so far to bring to their attention. This satirical portrayal suggested that religious institutions could become so focused on tradition, procedure, internal politics, and the preservation of their own power that they lost sight of basic moral obligations to protect the vulnerable and to act with integrity. The episode showed how institutional priorities could become completely divorced from the actual religious and moral principles that the institution was supposedly founded to uphold and promote. The satire became more extreme and absurd as the episode progressed, with the church officials shown as completely disconnected from reality and from the moral teachings about compassion, justice, and protection of the innocent that they were supposed to represent and embody. The episode used gross-out humor and shocking imagery to make its points about institutional dysfunction and moral corruption, pushing boundaries in ways that made many viewers extremely uncomfortable while still maintaining its satirical intent and its critique of institutional failure. The extreme nature of the humor served to emphasize how serious the real-world scandals were, and how inadequate and insufficient the church's institutional responses had been in protecting children and addressing the harm that had been done. Father Maxey eventually succeeded in getting the attention of church leadership by performing an act so shocking and attention-grabbing backstabbing that they could no longer ignore him or dismiss his concerns. The specific nature of this act was characteristic of South Park's willingness to use extreme and crude humor to make serious points. This led to a direct confrontation where Father Maxey challenged the church hierarchy about their failures to protect children, their complicity in allowing abuse to continue through inaction and cover-ups, and their prioritization of institutional reputation over the welfare of the vulnerable people they were supposed to protect. Father Maxey argued passionately and emotionally that the church needed to fundamentally reform its practices, to hold abusive priests fully accountable for their actions, to cooperate with legal authorities rather than covering up crimes, and to prioritize the welfare and safety of children over the preservation of institutional reputation and the avoidance of scandal. He spoke as someone who genuinely believed in the church's mission and religious teachings, making his criticism more powerful because it came from inside the institution rather than from external critics who might be dismissed as hostile to religion. The episode's resolution involves some church officials beginning to acknowledge the seriousness of the problem and the need for reform, though the episode made clear that meaningful change would be difficult and would face resistance from those invested in maintaining traditional power structures and avoiding accountability. Father Maxey returned to South Park, having succeeded in forcing the issue onto the church's agenda, and in making sure that church leadership could no longer simply ignore or minimize the abuse scandals. However, the episode did not present a simplistic happy ending where all problems were solved. The resolution was somewhat ambiguous, reflecting the reality that institutional reform is slow and difficult, especially in large traditional organizations with entrenched interests and centuries of established practices. The controversial nature of __quote_21__ stemmed from its willingness to address sexual abuse directly and explicitly rather than treating it delicately, avoiding the subject entirely, or handling it with the kind of careful restraint that other television shows would employ. The episode used extreme humor and shocking content to make sure viewers could not look away from or minimize the seriousness of the abuse scandals, or treat them as minor problems. Some critics and viewers argued that the episode's crude humor was inappropriate and disrespectful given the real trauma suffered by real victims of abuse. Others argued that the episode's unflinching approach was necessary and valuable to break through the institutional denial, public avoidance, and cultural reluctance to discuss these issues that had allowed the abuse to continue for so long without adequate response. The episode also included a substantial subplot involving the parents of South Park becoming so concerned and worried about potential abuse in the Catholic Church that they made the decision to pull their children out of religious education classes entirely. They decided it was too risky to allow their children to be in situations where priests or other church officials would have access to them. This parental response was understandable given the news about abuse scandals, showing how institutional failures damaged trust between religious communities and the families they served. However, the complete removal of religious and moral instruction led to unintended negative consequences in the episode's storyline. The children were left without any formal moral or ethical instruction, guidance about right and wrong, or framework for understanding how to treat others and make ethical decisions. This resulted in them behaving in increasingly selfish, destructive, and antisocial ways because they had no moral education to guide their behavior or help them understand the consequences of their actions. This subplot suggested that while the church had serious institutional problems that absolutely needed to be addressed and could not be ignored or excused, religious education and moral instruction still served important functions in helping children develop ethical frameworks and understanding of right and wrong. The episode walked a careful line, criticizing institutional failures severely, while also acknowledging that religious communities and religious education could play positive roles when functioning properly and when leaders acted with integrity. The balance between these two aspects of the episode showed South Park's nuanced approach to religious satire, even when dealing with extremely serious and sensitive subjects. The show could be harshly critical of institutional failures and moral corruption, while still acknowledging that religion and religious communities served positive purposes when functioning according to their stated values. The problem was not religion itself or religious faith, but rather the specific failures of particular institutions and individuals to live up to their own stated values, moral teachings, and ethical obligations. __quote_22__ also examined how church hierarchy and institutional structure could enable problems rather than preventing them or providing accountability. The episode showed how the chain of command in the Catholic Church, with authority flowing upward through priests to bishops to cardinals to the Pope, could become a mechanism for avoiding accountability rather than ensuring it. When problems occurred at lower levels of the hierarchy, they could be reported upward to higher authorities, authorities, but then ignored or covered up by those higher authorities who were more concerned with protecting the institution than with addressing wrongs and protecting victims. The episode depicted Vatican officials as being primarily concerned with maintaining traditions exactly as they had been practiced for centuries, preserving elaborate rituals and ceremonies, and protecting the church's public image and institutional influence, rather than with the spiritual welfare of ordinary believers or with fundamental moral truth and ethical behavior. This satirical portrayal suggested that large religious institutions could become more focused on institutional survival and the preservation of power than on the religious missions they were originally created to serve. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving beyond established Christianity, South Park turned its satirical attention toward newer religious movements and alternative belief systems that had developed in more recent American history. Section 5. Mormonism and Perspective. South Park's approach to different religions varied depending on the specific characteristics, history, and cultural position of each faith tradition. When the show turned its attention to Mormonism, officially known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, it took a notably different approach than it had used for Christianity or Catholicism. While maintaining its irreverent style and willingness to mock sacred beliefs, the show also displayed a surprising degree of empathy and respect for Mormon people and their communities, even while satirizing the religion's origin story and distinctive theological claims. Quote 23 from Season 7 aired in November 2003 and stands out as one of South Park's most thoughtful and nuanced treatments of any religious subject. The episode told a longer, more developed story than many South Park episodes typically featured, taking time to develop characters and to present Mormon beliefs and practices in detail before delivering its satirical commentary. The episode balanced genuine respect for Mormon people and communities with sharp criticism of religious claims that the show presented as absurd or unbelievable. The episode began with the Marsh family meeting a new family that had just moved to South Park from Utah. The new family consisted of a father, mother, and a son named Gary, who was around Stan's age. From their first appearance, this Mormon family was portrayed as remarkably cheerful, polite, helpful, and wholesome. They were friendly to everyone they met, eager to be good neighbors, and consistently kind and positive in their interactions with others. This portrayal was important because it established these characters as genuinely good people before the episode began examining their religious beliefs. Stan quickly became friends with Gary, the Mormon boy. Gary invited Stan to his house to spend time together, and Stan was impressed by how functional, loving, and happy Gary's family appeared to be. The parents were affectionate with each other and with their children. The children were respectful and well-behaved without seeming oppressed or afraid. The family ate meals together, talked openly about their feelings and experiences, and genuinely seemed to enjoy each other's company. This stood in stark contrast to Stan's own family, where his parents fought frequently, his father was often drunk or involved in ridiculous schemes, and family meals were tense or chaotic. During Stan's visit to Gary's house, the family began sharing information about their Mormon faith. They explained that they were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and that their religious beliefs were central to how they lived their lives and organized their family. They invited Stan to attend church with them, and Stan agreed out of curiosity and because he liked Gary and wanted to be a good friend. This decision to attend Mormon services set up the episode's examination of Mormon beliefs and practices. The episode showed the Mormon church service as similar in some ways to other Christian services, with hymns, prayers, and teachings about Jesus Christ and moral living. However, the service also included elements specific to Mormon theology and practice. Gary's family explained various Mormon beliefs to Stan, including their understanding of the Book of Mormon as scripture, their belief in modern prophets who received revelation from God, and their practices around missionary work and family organization. The most significant and satirical part of All About Mormons came when the episode depicted the origin story of Mormonism and the life of Joseph Smith, the religion's founder. This section of the episode used a musical storytelling style with a cheerful song accompanying animated sequences showing events from Mormon history and theology. The song and visuals recounted how Joseph Smith claimed to have been visited by an angel named Moroni in the 1820s in upstate New York, how he claimed to have been led to golden plates buried in a hill, how he claimed to have translated these plates into the Book of Mormon with the help of special stones, and how he founded a new religious movement based on these revelations. Throughout this retelling of Mormon origins, the episode repeatedly included a voice saying, quote, _25_ in a mocking tone, suggesting that the claims being made were stupid or unbelievable. The episode presented various elements of the Joseph Smith story with deliberate emphasis on aspects that seemed implausible or convenient, such as the claim that the golden plates had to be returned to the angel and could not be examined by others, characters, or the claim that Smith translated ancient Reformed Egyptian text using stones in a hat. The satirical presentation made clear that the show's creators found these origin claims difficult to believe and wanted viewers to question them as well. The episode also mentioned various controversial aspects of early Mormon history, including Joseph Smith's practice of polygamy, conflicts with neighbors and authorities that led to the Mormons being driven from multiple locations, and Smith's eventual death at the hands of a mob in Illinois. These historical facts were presented in the same cheerful musical style as the rest of the origin story, creating a jarring contrast between the serious and often violent historical events and the upbeat presentation. This satirical retelling of Mormon origins was interspersed with scenes of Stan becoming increasingly uncomfortable and skeptical as he learned more about Mormon beliefs and history. Stan could not understand how intelligent, reasonable people like Gary and his family could believe claims that seemed obviously false or absurd. He became frustrated trying to reconcile his respect and affection for this family with his inability to accept their religious beliefs as credible. Meanwhile, Gary's family remained consistently kind, generous, and helpful to the Marsh family, despite receiving hostility and mockery from Stan's father, Randy, who became obsessed with proving that Mormonism was false and getting Stan away from Gary's influence. Randy's antagonism toward the Mormon family was portrayed as unreasonable and mean-spirited, showing that prejudice against Mormons was wrong, even if skepticism about Mormon theological claims might be justified. The episode climaxed with a confrontation where Stan told Gary directly that he thought Mormon beliefs were stupid and that he could not understand how Gary could believe them. Stan expected Gary to either defend his beliefs with evidence or to acknowledge that the beliefs did not make rational sense. However, Gary's response took a different direction that became the emotional and thematic heart of the episode. Gary acknowledged that Stan and others might think Mormon beliefs were silly or hard to believe. He admitted that he could not prove his religious claims were true in any objective or scientific sense. However, Gary then explained that his Mormon faith had given him and his family a strong, loving community, clear moral guidance, and a sense of purpose and meaning in life. He pointed out that his family was happy, functional, and supportive in ways that Stan's family was not. He argued that even if Stan did not believe in Mormon theology, he should be able to see that the Mormon faith had produced positive outcomes in Gary's life and family. Gary's speech concluded with him essentially telling Stan off for being judgmental and for dismissing the value that religion brought to people's lives just because he did not share their beliefs. This moment was powerful because it came from the character who had been the target of mockery throughout the episode. Gary stood up for himself and his family while acknowledging the legitimacy of others' skepticism. The episode suggested that religious belief could be valuable and meaningful for people even if the specific theological claims could not be proven or might seem absurd to outsiders. This resolution was unusual for South Park and showed a more complex and empathetic approach to religious satire than many other episodes displayed. The episode did not back down from mocking Mormon origin stories and theological claims. The "dum dum 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 dum" refrain made the show's skepticism absolutely clear. However, the episode also forced viewers to consider that religious communities could provide real benefits to their members, that religious people could be genuinely good and happy individuals, and that dismissing religion entirely because of skepticism about specific beliefs might miss something important about how religion functioned in people's lives. All About Mormons also made a point about prejudice and how people could hold contradictory attitudes toward religion and religious people. Randy Marsh was shown as being hostile toward the Mormon family despite having no good reason beyond his discomfort with their religious beliefs. His hostility made him look foolish and mean, especially because the Mormon family was consistently kind and helpful to him even when he was rude to them. The episode suggested that opposing or mocking religious beliefs was different from treating religious people badly or refusing to acknowledge positive qualities they might possess. The episode's treatment of Mormon missionary work also deserves attention. Gary and his family invited Stan to church and shared their beliefs with him, which reflected the real Mormon emphasis on missionary work and conversion. However, when Stan made clear that he was not interested in becoming Mormon, Gary remained his friend and did not pressure him further. This portrayed Mormon missionary activity as earnest and sincere, rather than as manipulative or coercive, even while the episode made fun of the beliefs being promoted. The portrayal of Mormon family life in the episode was notably positive. Gary's family demonstrated genuine love, mutual respect, clear communication, and shared values. The parents were attentive to their children's needs and feelings. The children were confident and happy without being spoiled or disrespectful. Family prayer and religious practice were shown as bringing the family together rather than as sources of conflict or oppression. This positive portrayal stood in contrast to how the episode depicted Stan's non-Mormon family, where dysfunction and conflict were common. The episode also acknowledged that Mormon communities provided strong social support networks for their members. Gary's family had moved to a new town and quickly integrated into the local Mormon community, receiving help and friendship from other church members. This aspect of religious community was presented as valuable and meaningful, showing that religion could serve important social functions beyond just providing answers to theological questions. __quote_28__ represented a more mature and thoughtful approach to religious satire than South Park had sometimes displayed. The episode recognized that people's relationships with religion were complex, that religious communities could be genuinely beneficial even if their theological claims were questionable, and that good people could hold beliefs that others found absurd. The satire was still sharp, and the mockery of Mormon origin stories was unrelenting. Yet the episode also conveyed respect for Mormon people and recognition that their faith brought real value to their lives. The episode's final message seemed to be that while it was fair to question and even mock religious claims that seemed implausible, it was important to recognize the human beings who held those beliefs and to acknowledge the positive aspects of religious communities. Gary's angry speech to Stan essentially argued that skepticism about religion should not prevent people from treating religious individuals with respect and from recognizing when religious practice produced good outcomes in people's lives. This balanced approach made Quote 29 one of South Park's most memorable and discussed religious episodes. The episode demonstrated that the show could be irreverent and satirical while also being thoughtful and empathetic. It showed that criticism of religious beliefs could coexist with respect for religious people and appreciation for the functions that religion served in communities and individual lives. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. From this relatively gentle treatment of an American-born religious movement, the show would soon take on a much more controversial and legally risky target that would generate international attention and real-world consequences. Section 6. Scientology and Outrage. If __quote_30__ represented South Park's most balanced and empathetic approach to religious satire, then Trapped in the Closet from Season 9 represented the opposite extreme. This episode, which aired in November 2005, took aim at Scientology with aggressive directness and no apparent concern for potential consequences. The episode became one of the most controversial in South Park's entire run, generating intense public debate, alleged threats of legal action, and claims of interference from powerful figures within the entertainment industry who were connected to Scientology. The episode demonstrated South Park's willingness to confront organizations and belief systems that many other television shows would avoid entirely due to fear of retaliation or legal complications. Trapped in the Closet began with Stan taking a personality test that was being offered for free in the town of South Park. This personality test was administered by representatives of Scientology, though the episode did not immediately make this connection obvious or clear to viewers unfamiliar with Scientology recruitment tactics. The people administering the test were friendly and approachable, presenting the test as a simple way for Stan to learn more about himself and his emotional state. Stan answered a series of questions about his life, his feelings, his relationships with family and friends, and his experiences at school and in the community. After Stan completed the test, the administrators reviewed his answers using their scoring system and charts. They told him that according to their analysis, he was depressed, unhappy, and struggling with problems that he might not even be fully aware of or able to recognize on his own. They explained that many people go through life not realizing they have these kinds of issues affecting their happiness and success. They encouraged him to come to their center to learn more about how they could help him improve his life, overcome the obstacles holding him back, and achieve his full potential as a person. Their presentation was persuasive and seemed genuinely concerned about Stan's well-being. This opening sequence satirized how Scientology recruits new members through personality testing and free stress tests offered in public places like city streets, shopping areas, and community events. The organization uses these tests as tools to identify potential converts by suggesting that test takers have problems or deficiencies that Scientology can address. The tests are designed and scored in ways that almost always produce results indicating that the person needs help, creating an entry point for recruitment and initial contact. South Park presented this process as manipulative and predatory, showing how the organization targeted vulnerable people, or people who might be seeking meaning, by first convincing them they had serious problems and then offering Scientology as the only real solution to those problems. Stan visited the Scientology Center and was introduced to various concepts and practices from Scientology doctrine and methodology. The center was depicted as a professional-looking facility with offices, counseling rooms, and materials explaining Scientology beliefs and practices. The episode depicted Scientology's use of devices called e-meters, which are instruments that look somewhat like simple electronics with dials, wires, and metal cylinders that subjects hold in their hands during sessions. Scientologists claim these e-meters can measure a person's mental and spiritual state by detecting changes in electrical resistance in the body as the person thinks about different topics or answers questions. During counseling sessions called auditing, which is a central practice in Scientology, Scientologists ask subjects questions while the subject holds the e-meter cans in their hands. The auditor watches the e-meter's needle movements carefully and interprets these movements to supposedly reveal hidden traumas, past life experiences, spiritual blockages, and other issues affecting the person's current life and happiness. The process is presented as a scientific or therapeutic technique rather than as a religious ritual, though it serves religious purposes within Scientology's belief system. Stan was connected to an e-meter during his auditing sessions at the Scientology Center. The Scientologist conducting the session, who is portrayed as serious and professional, asked him various questions about his life, his feelings, his relationships, and his experiences while carefully watching the e-meter's needle movements and making notes. The auditor interpreted these readings in ways that consistently suggested Stan had deep-seated problems, unresolved traumas, and spiritual issues requiring extensive additional counseling and deeper involvement with Scientology practices and teachings. Every session seemed to reveal new issues that needed to be addressed through more auditing, more courses studying Scientology materials, and more commitment to the organization and its practices. When one issue was supposedly resolved or addressed, the e-meter readings would indicate that another problem had been uncovered that also needed attention. This satirized how Scientology uses its own specialized terminology, technology, and interpretive frameworks to keep members engaged, dependent on the organization's services, and continuously paying for materials and counseling that the organization claims are necessary for spiritual progress and personal improvement. The major comedic and satirical thrust of the episode came when Scientology leaders determined through e-meter readings that Stan was the reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology who had died in 1986. Scientology teaches that individuals are immortal spiritual beings called thetans, who have lived through many past lives spanning millions or even billions of years. So the concept of reincarnation and past life identity fits within Scientology's theological framework and belief system. This claim that Stan was L. Ron Hubbard reborn led to Stan being treated as an extremely important and revered figure within Scientology, almost like a messiah or prophet returned to guide the faithful. High-ranking members of the organization traveled from around the country to South Park to meet him in person, to pay their respects, and to ask him questions about Scientology's future direction, organizational decisions, and theological interpretations. They treated him with reverence and deference, hanging on his every word and treating his opinions as divinely inspired guidance. Stan was completely confused and uncomfortable with all this attention and reverence because he had no memory of being L. Ron Hubbard, no knowledge of Scientology beyond what he had recently learned at the center, and no understanding of why these intelligent-seeming adults believed he was their founder, returned to life. He tried to tell them he was just a regular kid from South Park, which they interpreted as humility or as a test of their faith, rather than as a straightforward statement of fact. His confusion and discomfort were played for comedy, while also highlighting how Scientology's belief system could lead to absurd conclusions when applied literally to real situations. The episode then included an extended sequence explaining Scientology's origin story and core theological beliefs about human history and the nature of spiritual reality. This sequence was presented in a documentary style with simple animation showing the events being described in visual form. Crucially, text appeared on screen repeatedly throughout this sequence stating, "This is what Scientologists actually believe," emphasizing that the show was not making up absurd stories to mock Scientology or exaggerating for comedic effect. The creators were instead accurately presenting beliefs that real Scientologists held as central tenets of their faith, beliefs that were taught to members who reached higher levels in the organization. This framing was absolutely crucial because the story being presented was so bizarre, implausible, and science fiction-like that viewers Viewers who were unfamiliar with Scientology might have assumed the show was inventing ridiculous content purely for mockery. The Scientology origin story, as presented in the episode, described events that supposedly occurred 75 million years ago, involving an alien ruler named Xenu, who governed a confederation of 76 planets that were facing severe overpopulation problems. According to Scientology doctrine, as explained in the episode, Xenu solved the overpopulation crisis by gathering billions of beings from across these planets, transporting them to Earth, which was called Tegiak at that time, in spacecraft that resembled DC-8 airplanes. He placed them near volcanoes located around the planet and then destroyed them with hydrogen bombs detonated in the volcanoes. The spirits or souls of these destroyed beings, called Thetans in Scientology terminology, were then captured using special electronic traps and subjected to a process of implantation, where they were taken to special facilities, shown images on screens, and given false beliefs and memories over a period of 36 days. This brainwashing process involved showing them misleading pictures and concepts designed to confuse them about their true nature and identity. After this intensive brainwashing and implantation process, the confused and traumatized Thetans were released into the environment, where they attached themselves to human bodies. According to Scientology, these body Thetans have remained attached to humans ever since, influencing human behavior, causing psychological and spiritual problems, and preventing people from achieving their full potential. The animated sequences in the episode showed the spacecraft arriving at Earth, the beings being positioned near volcanoes around the planet, the massive explosions destroying them, and the subsequent capture and processing of the Thetans in the implantation facilities. The visual presentation made the story look like a cheesy, low-budget science fiction movie from the 1970s, emphasizing through visual style how implausible and ridiculous the show's creators found these beliefs to be. The animation showed DC-8 airplanes flying through space, cartoon aliens being herded into positions, crude depictions of nuclear explosions, and spiritual beings being processed through strange machines. Meanwhile, the episode included a subplot involving celebrities who were known Scientologists in real life. Tom Cruise, one of the most famous actors in Hollywood and perhaps the most prominent and vocal Scientologist in the entertainment industry, appeared as a character in the episode. When Stan, as the supposed reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard, met Tom Cruise, Cruise was extremely excited and honored to meet someone he believed was the founder of his religion. Cruise asked Stan to read his latest film script and to give him an honest opinion about whether it was good. Stan read the script carefully and then gave his honest assessment that he thought it was not very good and needed significant improvements. This mild, constructive criticism completely devastated Tom Cruise in the episode. He became extremely upset, appeared to suffer an emotional breakdown, ran into Stan's bedroom, locked himself in the closet, and refused to come out no matter how much people pleaded with him or tried to convince him to emerge from the closet. The title Trapped in the Closet referred both to Tom Cruise literally being trapped inside Stan's bedroom closet and to speculation and rumors about Tom Cruise's sexuality that existed in tabloid media and popular gossip culture at the time. The episode played with this double meaning throughout, with various characters coming to Stan's house and trying to get Tom Cruise to quote 35, a phrase that carries obvious implications beyond its literal meaning of physically leaving a closet. The episode never stated these implications directly, allowing the double meaning to work through suggestion. Other celebrity Scientologists, including actor John Travolta and musician R. Kelly, also appeared in the episode. They came to Stan's house to try to convince Tom Cruise to come out of the closet, speaking to him through the closed door and trying to reason with him. However, when their attempts to coax Tom Cruise out failed, both John Travolta and R. Kelly ended up going into the closet themselves and also refusing to come out. The closet became increasingly crowded with celebrity Scientologists who would not emerge. Stan eventually became frustrated and angry with being treated as L. Ron Hubbard's reincarnation and with the absurd beliefs and practices he was being exposed to at the Scientology Center. He confronted Scientology leaders directly and told them in explicit terms that he thought Scientology was a scam and a fraud designed to make money from vulnerable people who were seeking help, meaning, and purpose in their lives. He pointed out that L. Ron Hubbard had been a science fiction writer before founding Scientology, someone who made a living creating fictional stories about aliens and space adventures. Stan argued that Hubbard had created an elaborate fictional story full of aliens, space opera elements, and implausible events, and then convinced people to treat this story as religious truth and to pay large amounts of money for courses and materials teaching these beliefs as fact. The Scientology leaders in the episode responded to Stan's direct criticism, not with theological arguments or evidence supporting their beliefs, Instead, they responded with immediate threats of lawsuits and legal action. They told Stan that Scientology had extensive legal resources, teams of lawyers, and would sue anyone who spoke against the organization or revealed its secrets. This satirized Scientology's well-documented history of using aggressive legal tactics against critics, former members, and journalists. Stan told them to go ahead and sue him, daring them to do their worst. The episode concluded with unusual credits listing every name as __quote _36 or _quote _37 as a protective measure. The aftermath became controversial. Comedy Central pulled the episode from reruns. Reports suggested Tom Cruise threatened to refuse promoting his film unless the rebroadcast was canceled. Isaac Hayes, who voiced Chef and was a Scientologist, quit the show, claiming he objected to religious mockery, despite years of South Park satirizing other religions without his complaint. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The same willingness to push boundaries would lead South Park into even more philosophically ambitious territory when examining belief systems that claim to reject religion entirely. Section 7. Atheism and Organized Non-Belief. South Park's willingness to satirize any belief system, regardless of how sacred or protected it might seem, extended naturally to atheism and organized skepticism. While many might assume that a show critical of religion would embrace atheism as the rational alternative, South Park instead treated atheism with the same irreverent skepticism it applied to religious faiths. The show recognized that atheism, particularly when organized into movements or when held with dogmatic certainty, could exhibit many of the same problems that characterized organized religion, including intolerance, arrogance, tribalism, and the desire to force beliefs onto others. Quote 38 and quote 39 from season 10, which aired in November 2006, provided South Park's most extensive examination of atheism and its potential consequences. These two-part episodes told a complex science fiction story that used time travel and future societies to explore what might happen if atheism completely replaced religion in human civilization. The episodes demonstrated that South Park's creators saw potential dangers in both religious extremism and in atheist movements that took on quasi-religious characteristics themselves. The episodes began in the present day, with Mrs. Garrison teaching evolution in her science class at South Park Elementary. Richard Dawkins, the famous evolutionary biologist and atheist author, appeared as a character in the episode. In real life, Dawkins had become known not just for his scientific work on evolution and genetics, which was genuinely important and influential. Instead, he had also become famous for his aggressive criticism of religion and his promotion of atheism as the only rational worldview. His books like Quote 40 argued that religious belief was irrational, harmful, and incompatible with modern scientific understanding. In the South Park episode, Richard Dawkins came to town to support Mrs. Garrison's teaching of evolution against religious opposition from some parents and community members who wanted creationism taught alongside evolution or instead of it. Dawkins and Mrs. Garrison began a romantic relationship, bonding over their shared commitment to science and their shared frustration with religious thinking. Their relationship was portrayed as passionate and genuine, showing that the episode was not simply dismissing Dawkins or his scientific credentials as worthless or fraudulent. However, Dawkins' character in the episode also displayed significant arrogance and condescension toward religious believers. He spoke about religious people as if they were stupid or mentally deficient, rather than as intelligent people who simply held different beliefs. He expressed certainty that science had all the answers and that religion had nothing valuable to offer humanity. This portrayal captured real criticisms that had been made of Dawkins and other prominent atheist activists, that they sometimes displayed an attitude of intellectual superiority and moral smugness that alienated potential allies and made productive dialogue difficult. Cartman, who was frustrated with having to wait 3 weeks for the Nintendo Wii gaming console to be released, decided to freeze himself cryogenically so he could skip the waiting period and wake up when the Wii was available. This was a reference to a South Park episode from years earlier where Cartman had frozen himself to avoid waiting for something he wanted. Through a series of accidents and misunderstandings, Cartman ended up frozen for not 3 weeks, instead for hundreds of years into the future, waking up in a world that had changed dramatically. When Cartman woke up in this distant future, he discovered a world where atheism had completely triumphed over religion. There were no churches, no religious believers, no prayer, and no worship of any kind. Richard Dawkins's teachings and arguments had apparently convinced humanity to abandon religion entirely. At first, this seemed like it might be portrayed as a utopia, a world that had moved beyond superstition and embraced pure reason and scientific thinking. However, the future world Cartman encountered was anything except peaceful or united. The atheists had split into different factions that were at war with each other over minor differences in their atheist philosophies and scientific interpretations. There were groups called the Unified Atheist League, the United Atheist Alliance, and the Allied Atheist Alliance. These groups, despite all being atheist and despite all supposedly being devoted to reason and science, were engaged in violent conflicts with each other over questions about the proper name for what science should be called, and other trivial disagreements. The satire here was sharp and clear. The episode showed that removing religion from human society did not automatically create peace, harmony, or rational cooperation. Instead, the atheist factions behaved exactly like religious groups had behaved throughout history, fighting holy wars over doctrinal differences that outsiders would consider meaningless or trivial. They were absolutely certain that their particular version of atheism was correct, and that the other atheist groups were dangerous heretics who needed to be stopped or destroyed. The different atheist factions in the future used terminology and organizational structures that resembled religious institutions. They had leaders who spoke with authority about the correct interpretation of scientific principles. They had followers who believed passionately in their faction's superiority and righteousness. They had rituals and practices that members were expected to follow. They excommunicated or expelled members who questioned the faction's positions. In every meaningful way except for the explicit worship of a deity, these atheist organizations functioned as religions. The episode made explicit comparisons between the atheist faction wars and historical religious conflicts. Characters in the future spoke about the importance of converting others to their particular brand of atheism. They talked about the other factions as if they were evil or corrupt rather than simply mistaken. They justified violence and oppression in the name of protecting the true understanding of science and reason. The episode suggested that the problem was not religion specifically. Instead, the problem was human tribalism, dogmatism, and the tendency to divide into competing groups that view each other as enemies. Cartman, observing all this conflict and chaos, pointed out the obvious irony that the atheists were behaving exactly like the religious people they had replaced. He noted that they were fighting wars over meaningless differences just as religious people had done for thousands of years. The atheist characters rejected this comparison, insisting that their conflicts were different because they were based on reason and science rather than on superstition and faith. This rejection of obvious parallels satirized how people often cannot see their own hypocrisy, or how their behavior mirrors the behavior they criticize in others. The episodes also included another subplot set in the present day where Richard Dawkins and Mrs. Garrison's relationship continued to develop. Dawkins convinced Mrs. Garrison to abandon her recent conversion to Christianity and to embrace atheism fully. He argued that belief in God was irrational and that she would be happier and more intellectually honest if she accepted that the universe had no purpose or design. Mrs. Garrison was persuaded by these arguments and became an atheist. However, becoming an atheist did not make Mrs. Garrison more rational, kinder, or better as a person. Instead, she simply redirected her previous religious zealotry into atheist zealotry. She became as aggressive and intolerant in promoting atheism as she had been in promoting Christianity. She mocked religious students in her class. She dismissed religious ideas without genuine engagement. She displayed the same certainty and unwillingness to consider alternative perspectives that had characterized her religious phase. This portrayal suggested that the problem was not the specific content of Mrs. Garrison's beliefs, whether religious or atheist. Instead, the problem was her personality and her tendency toward extremism and intolerance. Some people would be extremists regardless of what belief system they adopted. Changing from religious belief to atheism did not automatically make someone more rational or tolerant if they already had a dogmatic personality. The resolution of the Go God Go two-part episodes involved Cartman eventually returning to his own time, having learned nothing from his experience in the atheist future, because Cartman never learned anything. However, the broader point of the episodes was made clearly for the audience. Atheism, when organized into movements and held with religious-like certainty and intolerance, could be just as problematic as organized religion. The solution to religious conflict was not simply replacing religion with atheism. Instead, it required addressing the underlying human tendencies toward tribalism, dogmatism, and intolerance that could attach themselves to any belief system. The episodes also satirized the new atheist movement that was prominent in the mid-2000s, led by figures like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, and Daniel Dennett. These thinkers had written popular books arguing against religion and promoting atheism, and they had developed significant followings of people who embraced their arguments. While South Park did not dismiss the scientific arguments these thinkers made, the show did critique the movement's tone, its certainty, and its tendency to view religious believers as inferior. The portrayal of Richard Dawkins in the episodes was notably complex. He was shown as intelligent and scientifically knowledgeable, making legitimate arguments about evolution and scientific evidence. However, he was also shown as arrogant, condescending, and blind to how his own atheist activism resembled religious proselytizing. He believed he was spreading enlightenment and reason, yet his approach created division and resentment rather than genuine understanding or productive dialogue. The Future Atheist Society also revealed another layer of satire about how people use belief systems. In the future, the atheist factions had turned science into something resembling theology. They argued about the proper interpretation of scientific principles with the same fervor that religious scholars argued about theological doctrines. They treated scientific authorities with the same reverence that religious people treated prophets or holy figures. They used scientific language and concepts to justify their political positions and social hierarchies, just as religious people had used religious language for the same purposes. This satirized a real phenomenon where some atheists and rationalists treat science almost as a replacement religion rather than as a methodology for understanding the natural world. Science became an identity and a worldview rather than simply a tool for investigating questions. Scientific consensus became treated as sacred and unquestionable rather than as the current best understanding based on available evidence. Scientists became elevated to positions of unquestionable authority rather than being seen as fallible humans doing their best to understand complex phenomena. The episode suggested that humans seem to need belief systems and group identities, and if traditional religion is removed, people will simply create new belief systems that serve similar psychological and social functions. The atheist factions in the future satisfied the human need for community, for shared purpose, for answers to big questions, and for clear distinctions between in-groups and out-groups. They provided everything that religion provided except for explicit supernatural beliefs. South Park's treatment of atheism in these episodes aligned with the show's broader approach to belief systems generally. The show was skeptical of certainty, whether religious or atheist. It criticized dogmatism wherever it appeared. It suggested that tolerance and humility were more important than being correct about metaphysical questions. It portrayed extremism as a personality trait rather than as a consequence of specific beliefs. The episodes also made a point about the relationship between belief and behavior. The future atheists believed different things than religious people believed, yet they behaved in remarkably similar ways, fighting wars, persecuting heretics, and claiming absolute truth. This suggested that beliefs matter less than how people hold those beliefs and how they treat others who disagree. A humble, tolerant religious person who respected others' rights to believe differently was portrayed more favorably than an arrogant, intolerant atheist who viewed disagreement as a sign of stupidity or moral failure. Go God Go and Go God Go 12 represented some of South Park's most thoughtful social commentary on religion, atheism, and human nature. The episodes use science fiction storytelling to explore philosophical questions about belief, identity, and conflict in ways that straightforward satire might not have achieved as effectively. The time travel structure allowed the show to imagine consequences and to extrapolate current trends into possible futures, creating a cautionary tale about the dangers of replacing one form of dogmatism with another. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. While South Park had examined individual religions and atheism separately, the show also created episodes that brought different belief systems into direct contact to explore how they related to each other. Section 8. Shared Beliefs and Prophecies. While South Park had examined individual religions separately and explored atheism's potential for dogmatism, the show also created episodes that brought different belief systems together around common themes and shared expectations. These episodes explored how different faiths could interpret the same events in completely different ways, how prophecy and religious symbolism functioned across traditions, and how attempts at unity could paradoxically create new conflicts and misunderstandings. By examining how multiple religions responded to the same phenomenon, the show could highlight both universal human tendencies around belief and the specific ways that different theological frameworks shaped interpretation. Quote 44 from season 17, which aired in November 2013, provided South Park's most direct examination of how Judaism, Christianity, and Islam could all respond to the same supposed sign or miracle while interpreting it through completely different theological lenses. The episode used a prank gone wrong to explore religious prophecy, the hunger for signs and meaning, and the gap between religious leaders' stated goals of peace and their actual behavior when confronted with events they claim to want. The episode began with Cartman playing a prank on Kyle by doctoring a photograph to make it appear that a cow at a local farm had red hair, making it a ginger cow. Cartman's motivation for this prank was rooted in his ongoing antagonism toward Kyle and his desire to humiliate Kyle in front of their classmates. The prank was meant to be simple and temporary, a fake photograph that would fool people briefly before being revealed as false. Cartman had no idea that his small-scale prank would intersect with religious prophecy and create international consequences. However, when the photograph of the supposedly red-haired cow was published and circulated, religious scholars and leaders from multiple faiths became extremely interested. It turned out that Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions all contained prophecies involving a red heifer or a red cow that would signal important religious events. These prophecies, while existing in different forms across the three faiths, all treated the appearance of such an animal as significant and meaningful for understanding God's plans and the approach of important spiritual or historical changes. In Jewish tradition, the episode explained, a red heifer was needed for certain purification rituals described in the Torah. According to religious texts and rabbinical interpretation, the ashes of a perfectly red heifer were required for ritual purification, particularly in preparation for rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. Some interpretations of Jewish prophecy suggested that finding a qualifying red heifer would be a sign that conditions were right for this rebuilding, which connected to broader messianic expectations and end times theology. Christian interpretations, as presented in the episode, also connected a red heifer to end times prophecy and to events described in the book of Revelation. Some Christian theologians and prophecy interpreters believed that a red heifer appearing would signal the beginning of events leading to the second coming of Christ. The specific details of how the heifer connected to Christian eschatology varied among different denominations and interpretive traditions, yet the general idea that such an animal represented an important sign appeared across multiple Christian perspectives. Islamic tradition, the episode showed, similarly contained prophecies involving signs and portents that would precede the Day of Judgment and the end of the current age. While the specific details differed from Jewish and Christian interpretations, Islamic scholars in the episode also viewed the appearance of this cow as potentially significant for understanding the timing of prophesied events. The remarkable aspect that the episode highlighted was that all three religions, despite their many theological differences and historical conflicts, shared this one point of intersection around prophecy involving a red cow. This convergence created an unusual situation where Jewish rabbis, Christian ministers, and Islamic clerics all agreed that the same animal was important and meaningful, even though they interpreted its significance in different and sometimes contradictory ways. Religious leaders from all three faiths traveled to South Park to examine the cow and to verify whether it truly met the prophetic requirements described in their respective traditions. This brought together people who normally had little contact with each other and whose religions had often been in conflict throughout history. The episode showed these religious leaders initially approaching each other with some suspicion and caution, carrying centuries of theological disagreement and historical tension. However, something unexpected happened during their examination of the cow and their discussions with each other. The religious leaders discovered that despite their deep theological differences about the nature of God, the proper way to worship, the identity of prophets, and countless other doctrinal matters, they all genuinely wanted peace. They all expressed fatigue with religious conflict and violence. They all hoped that this prophesied sign might create an opportunity for different faiths to come together rather than to fight over interpretation and significance. The episode portrayed these religious leaders as sincere in their desire for peace and cooperation, showing them having genuine conversations about their shared hopes for humanity and their shared concerns about violence and suffering caused by religious extremism and conflict. They began working together to protect the cow, to study it cooperatively, and to consider how its appearance might be used to promote interfaith understanding rather than to fuel additional conflict. This portrayal was notably sympathetic and suggested that many religious leaders, even those representing traditions with long histories of conflict, genuinely wanted to find common ground and to reduce violence and suffering. The episode suggested that the problem was not primarily with these moderate, thoughtful religious leaders who were capable of dialogue and cooperation. Instead, the problem came from extremists who would not accept peace and from the structural difficulties of maintaining interfaith cooperation in the face of theological disagreements. Cartman, observing all this international religious attention focused on his prank, became increasingly nervous about being discovered as the source of the fake photograph. He knew that if religious leaders discovered the cow was not actually red, but had been made to appear so through doctored photography and later through actual physical alteration, there would be serious consequences. Cartman had turned his prank into reality by actually dyeing a regular cow's hair red, creating a physical manifestation of his fake photograph. As the religious leaders continued their examination and their cooperation, they announced plans for a major interfaith gathering where they would use the appearance of the prophesied cow as an opportunity to promote peace, dialogue, and cooperation among Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They spoke about how this sign had brought them together and how it demonstrated that different faiths could work toward shared goals despite theological differences. They expressed hope that this moment could mark a turning point in reducing religious violence and conflict. However, the episode's satire became sharper when examining what happened to this hopeful interfaith cooperation. The problem came not from theological disagreement among the moderate leaders. Instead, it came from the human tendency towards self-interest, the fear of losing religious authority and identity, and the basic difficulty of maintaining cooperation when people have spent centuries in conflict. Some religious leaders began to worry that too much cooperation and unity would blur the distinct identities of their faiths. They feared that if Jews, Christians, and Muslims became too friendly and too focused on their similarities, their followers might question what made their particular faith special or necessary. If all religions were essentially the same and all led to the same place, why would people maintain their specific religious identities and practices? This fear of losing distinctiveness created pressure against the interfaith cooperation, even among leaders who genuinely wanted peace. The episode also showed how extremists within each faith opposed the interfaith gathering and the cooperation among religious leaders. These extremists believed that compromise and cooperation with other faiths represented betrayal of their religion's truth claims and unique status. They wanted their faith to triumph over others rather than to coexist peacefully. They viewed the moderate leaders' willingness to work with other religions as weakness or heresy. The climax of the episode involved the revelation that the cow was not actually a fulfillment of prophecy. Instead, it was just a regular cow that had been dyed red as part of Cartman's prank. When this truth came out, the carefully constructed interfaith cooperation immediately collapsed. The religious leaders felt betrayed and humiliated. They had invested hope and effort into this supposed sign, had made public statements about its significance, and had worked together based on the belief that something genuinely prophetic was occurring. The response to discovering the prank was telling. Rather than maintaining the cooperative relationships they had built and recognizing that their ability to work together was valuable regardless of the cow's authenticity, the religious leaders became angry and accusatory. They blamed each other for the situation. They questioned each other's motives and sincerity. The goodwill and cooperation that had developed fell apart almost instantly once the prophesied sign was revealed as false. This reaction satirized how religious cooperation and interfaith dialogue often depended on external circumstances and shared interests, rather than on genuine transformation of underlying attitudes and beliefs. When conditions changed or when the basis for cooperation was removed, people reverted to their default positions of separation and mutual suspicion. The episode suggested that true peace and cooperation required more than just finding common ground around specific issues or events. It required addressing deeper fears, prejudices, and structural factors that kept different groups apart. The episode's treatment of prophecy itself was also significant. The show demonstrated how different religions could all claim prophecies about the same type of event, while interpreting that event's significance in completely different and sometimes contradictory ways. The red cow meant different things to Jews, Christians, and Muslims, yet all three groups agreed it was important. This raised questions about whether prophecies were genuinely divine predictions, or whether they were vague enough that people could read into them whatever they wanted to see. The hunger for signs and prophetic fulfillment that the episode portrayed reflected a real tendency in religious communities to search for evidence that their beliefs are true, and that divine plans are unfolding. When something appears that might fit a prophetic description, believers want to interpret it as meaningful rather than as coincidence or as a natural event. This desire for confirmation and for concrete evidence of spiritual truths made religious communities vulnerable to deception, misinterpretation, and disappointment. Ginger Cow also explored how media attention and public pressure affected religious leaders' behavior and decision-making. Once the international media began covering the story of the prophesied cow and the interfaith cooperation, the religious leaders felt pressure to maintain their public positions and to deliver on their promises of peace and cooperation. This external pressure both helped maintain the cooperation and also made it more fragile, as leaders worried about losing face or appearing weak if the cooperation failed. The episode's satirical edge came from showing how close different religions could come to genuine cooperation and peace, while also showing how easily that cooperation could collapse. The religious leaders had built real relationships and had found common ground. They had discovered that they agreed on many things and that their differences were not insurmountable. Yet all of this progress disappeared the moment the basis for their cooperation was revealed as false. This suggested that religious cooperation was possible, and that religious leaders were often more reasonable and moderate than the most extreme members of their faiths. However, it also suggested that cooperation was fragile and contingent, dependent on specific circumstances and vulnerable to disruption. The episode did not offer easy solutions or suggest that religious peace was impossible. Instead, it showed the complexity of interfaith relations and the genuine obstacles to lasting cooperation. The treatment of Cartman in this episode was also important for understanding its satirical message. Cartman, who had created the entire situation through a prank motivated by his personal antagonism toward Kyle, had accidentally created an opportunity for real peace and cooperation among major world religions. His selfish, petty action had, through completely unintended consequences, brought together people who normally would never have cooperated. This ironic situation highlighted how human behavior and historical events often resulted from combinations of intention and accident, of high-minded principles and base motives. The most significant moments in religious history or in interfaith relations might not come from careful planning or noble purposes. Instead, they might emerge from random circumstances or from actions taken for completely unrelated reasons. This perspective on how events unfolded added another layer to the episode's examination of prophecy and meaning. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. From prophecy and the temporary unity it inspired, the show would examine how religious satire itself became a source of real-world conflict and controversy. Section 9. Religion and Controversy. South Park's aggressive approach to religious satire did not exist in a vacuum. The show's willingness to mock sacred beliefs and to depict religious figures in irreverent ways generated real-world controversy, backlash, and even threats of violence. These external reactions to the show became part of the story itself, revealing how religious sensitivity functioned in modern culture, how fear shaped what could be said and shown on television, and how different religious communities responded differently to criticism and mockery. The controversies surrounding South Park's religious content demonstrated that the show was touching genuine cultural tensions and exposing uncomfortable truths about power, fear, and censorship in contemporary society. The most significant and revealing controversy involved the show's treatment of Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam. As discussed earlier, South Park had depicted Muhammad as a character in the 2001 episode Super Best Friends, without generating any meaningful controversy or backlash. The character appeared visually, had speaking lines, and was shown using supernatural powers to fight evil alongside other religious figures. At the time, this depiction generated no protests, no threats, and no censorship. The episode aired normally and remained available in reruns and on home video. However, the cultural context changed dramatically in the years following that episode. In 2005 and 2006, a Danish newspaper published cartoons depicting Muhammad in various ways, including some that were satirical or critical. These cartoons triggered massive protests across the Muslim world, with with demonstrations involving millions of people in dozens of countries. Some of these protests turned violent, resulting in deaths, injuries, and property destruction. The cartoonist received death threats and required police protection. The controversy demonstrated that depicting Muhammad visually had become an extremely sensitive issue that could provoke international incidents and violent responses. This changed context meant that when South Park tried to include Muhammad in later episodes, the situation was completely different from what had existed in 2001. In 2006, South Park created Cartoon Wars Part 1 and Cartoon Wars Part 2, which directly addressed the Danish cartoon controversy and the question of whether Comedy Central should show Muhammad on television. Within the fictional world of these episodes, the show Family Guy planned to air an episode featuring Muhammad, and the South Park characters debated whether this was appropriate or dangerous. The episodes themselves became a site of controversy and censorship. Comedy Central, the network that aired South Park, decided to censor the image of Muhammad in these episodes, despite the fact that the character had appeared uncensored in Super Best Friends years earlier. When Muhammad was supposed to appear on screen, viewers instead saw a black screen with the words "censored" written across it. This censorship happened both within the fictional narrative of the episode and in the actual broadcast, creating a complex situation where the show was being censored while also commenting on that very censorship. South Park's creators Trey Parker and Matt Stone were reportedly frustrated by Comedy Central's decision to censor Muhammad. They had designed the episodes to make a point about free speech and the dangers of allowing threats of violence to determine what could be shown on television. The censorship undermined their intended message and demonstrated that those threats were effective in restricting content. However, Parker and Stone also understood the network's position. Comedy Central executives were genuinely concerned about potential violence against the network, its employees, or the show's creators if Muhammad appeared uncensored. The situation became even more complicated and revealing in 2010 when South Park created a two-part episode titled 200 and 201 that brought back many characters and storylines from the show's history. These episodes included Muhammad as a character again, though the show's creators tried to work within censorship restrictions by having Muhammad hidden inside a bear costume for most of his appearances, so viewers never saw his actual form. Even this compromise was not acceptable to Comedy Central. The network censored additional content from these episodes beyond just Muhammad's appearance. Entire speeches about fear and intimidation were bleeped out and replaced with continuous censorship tones that made the dialogue incomprehensible. The censorship was so extensive that it damaged the episode's narrative coherence and made significant portions difficult to understand. This heavy censorship came after a radical Islamic website posted a message that many interpreted as a threat against Parker and Stone. The message included references to the murder of Theo van Gogh, a Dutch filmmaker who had been killed in 2004 by an Islamic extremist after making a film critical of Islam's treatment of women. The message also included the addresses of Comedy Central's offices and photos of Van Gogh's murdered body. While the people who posted the message claimed they were not making threats, the clear implication was that Parker and Stone could face similar violence if they continued to mock Muhammad. Comedy Central's decision to censor 200 and 201 so extensively demonstrated that these implied threats worked. The network was more afraid of potential violence from Islamic extremists than it was of criticism from free speech advocates or disappointment from South Park fans. This fear was understandable and arguably justified given what had happened to people like Theo van Gogh, the Danish cartoonists, and others who had been threatened or attacked for perceived insults to Islam. However, the censorship also proved that religious groups could successfully restrict content through intimidation and threats of violence. What made this situation particularly revealing was the double standard it created. South Park had spent years mocking Christianity, Judaism, Mormonism, Scientology, and other religions without facing anything comparable to the threats that came from depicting Muhammad. The show had shown Jesus Christ in countless episodes, often in undignified or mocking situations. It had shown Moses as a giant stone triangle. It had shown Joseph Smith and Mormon beliefs in explicitly satirical ways. It had attacked the Catholic Church, Scientology, and many other religious institutions and beliefs. All of these depictions generated some criticism and complaints, yet none resulted in credible death threats or network censorship. This created a situation where Islam received special protection not through law or through consistent application of standards about religious sensitivity, instead through fear of violent retaliation. The show could mock Christianity freely because Christians, while they might complain or criticize, did not generally respond with violence or credible threats of violence. The show could mock Judaism Judaism because Jewish communities, while they might be offended, responded through dialogue and criticism rather than through threats. The show could even mock Scientology despite that organization's reputation for aggressive legal tactics. However, the show could not mock Islam in the same way because some Muslims had demonstrated willingness to use violence in response to perceived insults. Parker and Stone address this double standard directly in interviews and in the content of their episodes. They argued that treating Islam differently from other religions was itself a form of prejudice and condescension. It suggested that Muslims could not handle the same criticism and satire that members of other faiths were expected to tolerate. It created a special protected status for one religion based purely on fear rather than on principle or respect. The creators also pointed out that the vast majority of Muslims had nothing to do with threats or violence and were not asking for special protection from satire. The censorship was being driven by fear of a small extremist minority who used violence and intimidation to enforce their interpretation of Islamic law onto non-Muslim societies. By giving into these tactics, Comedy Central was allowing extremists to control content and to impose their standards on everyone else. The controversy over depicting Muhammad revealed several important truths about religion, media, and modern culture. First, it showed that not all religious groups responded to criticism in the same ways. Different religious traditions had different histories, different cultural contexts, and different levels of comfort with satire and criticism. What seemed like equivalent treatment of different religions was actually received very differently depending on those religions' specific characteristics and histories. Second, the controversy demonstrated how fear shaped cultural expression and limited free speech in practice, even when free speech was protected in principle. American law guaranteed the right to satirize religion, yet actual television networks censored content because they feared violence. The legal right to speak freely meant little if exercising that right resulted in credible threats of murder. Third, the situation highlighted how satirists and critics were caught between competing principles and concerns. Parker and Stone believed in equal treatment of all religions, and in the importance of being able to criticize and satirize any belief system. However, they also had to consider the safety of themselves, their colleagues, and innocent people who might be targeted by extremists. Was it worth risking lives to make a point about free speech and equal treatment? Different people answered this question differently. The censorship of South Park's Muhammad episodes also sparked broader cultural debates about religious sensitivity, multiculturalism, and Western values. Some argued that Western societies should respect Islamic prohibitions against depicting Muhammad, even though those prohibitions were religious rules that non-Muslims did not follow. They suggested that showing sensitivity to different cultural and religious norms was more important than asserting the right to offend. Others argued that Western societies should not allow religious rules from any faith to determine what could be said or shown in secular contexts, and that giving special protection to Islam through fear would encourage other groups to use similar tactics. These debates did not have easy answers or clear resolutions. They involved genuine tensions between important values like religious tolerance, free expression, cultural sensitivity, and resistance to intimidation. South Park's experience with Muhammad censorship brought these tensions into sharp focus and forced people to confront difficult questions about how diverse societies with different value systems should function. The show's treatment of other religious controversies also deserves attention. The Catholic Church sex abuse scandal episode __quote_56__ generated significant criticism from Catholic organizations and from some Catholic viewers who felt the episode was unfair, offensive, or disrespectful to their faith. However, these criticisms took the form of written complaints, negative reviews, and organized letter-writing campaigns rather than threats of violence. The Catholic League, an organization devoted to defending Catholic interests, condemned the episode harshly and called for boycotts of advertisers. This was strong criticism and genuine backlash, yet it operated within normal bounds of cultural discourse rather than involving threats of harm. Similarly, the Scientology episode __quote_57__ generated backlash that was significant yet non-violent. As discussed earlier, Isaac Hayes quit the show over this episode, and there were reports of pressure from Tom Cruise and possibly from Scientology itself to prevent the episode from being rebroadcast. Scientology had a well-documented history of using legal tactics and harassment against critics, yet the response to this South Park episode remained within legal bounds, even if it was aggressive and involved corporate pressure. The episode was temporarily pulled from reruns, yet eventually returned to circulation and remains available today. The Mormon episode __quote_58__ generated relatively little backlash despite its aggressive mockery of Mormon origin stories. The episode's "dumb dumb 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 dumb" refrain mocking Joseph Smith's claims became widely known and was clearly designed to make Mormon beliefs seem absurd. Yet the Mormon community's response was measured and non-threatening. Some Mormons criticized the episode or expressed disappointment, yet the church itself did not organize major protests or campaigns against the show. The episode remained available and created no significant controversy beyond normal critical discussion. These different responses from different religious communities to similar levels of satirical treatment revealed patterns about how religious groups understood themselves, how they related to broader culture, and how they responded to criticism. Communities that were confident in their social position and that had long histories of cultural engagement tended to respond to satire with criticism and debate, rather than with attempts to silence or censor. Communities that felt embattled, marginalized, or under attack tended to respond more strongly and sometimes more aggressively. The backlash against South Park's religious content also demonstrated how the show had become culturally significant enough that its treatment of religion mattered. When South Park first started, it was a relatively small cable show with a limited audience. Its religious satire was noticed primarily by people who watched cable television late at night, and by those who sought out edgy, controversial content. However, as the show became more popular and more culturally influential, its depictions of religion reached wider audiences and had greater impact on public discourse about religious topics. By the mid-2000s, South Park episodes about religion generated mainstream media coverage, sparked discussions on news programs, and influenced how millions of people thought about religious issues. The show had become a significant voice in American culture's ongoing conversation about religion's role in modern life. This cultural influence meant that religious groups had more reason to care about how South Park portrayed them, and more incentive to respond when they felt they were being treated unfairly. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. South Park's pattern of generating controversy while satirizing religion revealed something deeper than just offensive humor targeting sacred beliefs. Section 10. What South Park really satirizes about religion. Understanding what South Park actually targeted in its religious satire requires looking beyond individual jokes or offensive depictions to examine the patterns across many episodes and many different religions. When viewed comprehensively, South Park's religious content revealed that the show was less interested in arguing about theological truth claims and more interested in examining human behavior around religion. The show satirized how people used religion, how religious identity functioned in communities, how religious institutions operated, and how belief systems interacted with other aspects of modern life like politics, commerce, and entertainment. One of South Park's most consistent satirical targets was religious hypocrisy, the gap between what religious people claimed to believe and how they actually behaved. This theme appeared in some of the show's earliest religious episodes and continued throughout its run across multiple seasons and different religious contexts. The show repeatedly portrayed characters who claimed to be devout believers, yet violated their religion's core moral teachings in obvious and sometimes spectacular ways. These characters would attend church regularly and participate in religious services, speak confidently about their faith and their relationship with God, and judge others harshly for not being religious enough or for not following religious rules. Yet simultaneously, these same characters would lie without hesitation when it served their interests, cheat in business or personal relationships, be deliberately cruel to others who were vulnerable or different, or pursue selfish interests without any apparent concern for the religious values they claimed to hold dear. The episode __quote_60__ from season 3 demonstrated this pattern clearly and established it as a recurring theme. The people of South Park attended church services and claimed to be religious Christians, genuinely concerned about sin, morality, and their spiritual standing before God. However, when they came to believe that spontaneous combustion was God's punishment for sin, and that people were literally catching fire and burning to death because of moral failures, they did not respond by trying to be more genuinely moral or more loving toward each other as their religion actually taught. Instead, they became obsessed with following arbitrary rules about what counted as sin, and with avoiding technical violations of religious law while still treating each other badly, still gossiping and judging, still being primarily focused on their own interests and social standing rather than on genuine spiritual transformation or moral improvement. This critique of hypocrisy appeared consistently across episodes about different religions and different religious contexts. In episodes about Catholicism like Red Hot Catholic Love, the show portrayed church officials who preached high moral standards about sexual purity and the sacred duty to protect the innocent. Yet these same officials protected abusive priests from consequences and prioritized institutional reputation over protecting vulnerable children who had been harmed. In episodes about evangelical Christianity and Christian culture, the show showed preachers and believers who talked constantly about Jesus and Christian values of love and compassion, yet displayed remarkable intolerance toward people who were different, showed transparent greed in their pursuit of money and influence, and demonstrated casual cruelty toward those they considered outside their community or beneath their concern. Another major satirical target was the commercialization of religion, and the way that faith became intertwined with consumer culture and profit motives in modern American society. Christian Rock Hard exemplified this critique by showing how Christian music and Christian entertainment could be more about marketing strategies and making money than about genuine spiritual expression or religious devotion. Cartman's ability to succeed quickly in the Christian rock market by simply taking secular love songs and changing references from romantic partners to Jesus, keeping the melodies and emotional content identical while just swapping out a few key words, satirized how Christian culture often appropriated mainstream cultural forms and added religious language without fundamentally changing the underlying content, values, or commercial nature of what was being produced. This commercialization critique extended beyond just Christian markets and Christian entertainment products. The show portrayed religious organizations across different faiths as businesses concerned primarily with membership numbers, donation levels, and financial sustainability rather than with spiritual truth or genuine service to communities. Religious leaders appeared as salespeople, recruiting new members using persuasive techniques borrowed from commercial marketing, extracting money from believers through appeals to faith and promises of spiritual benefits that could never be verified or proven. The show suggested that modern religion often functioned more like a consumer product than like a transcendent spiritual tradition, with different churches and faiths competing for market share in a religious marketplace and presenting themselves using marketing techniques borrowed directly from commercial advertising and brand management. The show also consistently satirized how people used religion for identity and tribal affiliation rather than for genuine spiritual seeking or moral transformation. Characters would identify strongly with their religious labels as markers of who they were, and would defend their religions fiercely against criticism or competition from other faiths. Yet their actual beliefs often seemed shallow and poorly thought through. Their understanding of their own religion's teachings appeared limited, and their religious practice seemed perfunctory and habitual rather than deeply meaningful. Religion functioned as a social identity and a marker of group membership, something that separated them from others and connected them to particular communities, rather than as a framework for understanding existence or as a guide for how to live ethically. Kyle's Jewish identity in South Park demonstrated this dynamic across many episodes throughout the series. Being Jewish was extremely important to Kyle and defined how he saw himself and how others in South Park saw him. It was a core part of his character that appeared in episode after episode. However, the show portrayed Kyle as someone whose Jewishness was more about cultural and ethnic identity than about theological beliefs or religious practice in any deep sense. He identified as Jewish, took offense when Judaism was mocked or attacked, and sometimes participated in Jewish rituals and traditions like attending synagogue or celebrating holidays. Yet the show rarely portrayed him as someone deeply engaged with Jewish theology, studying religious texts, or as someone whose day-to-day behavior was substantially shaped by Jewish religious teachings about ethics and right living. This treatment of religious identity as primarily social and cultural, rather than spiritual or theological, appeared across the show's treatment of different religions and different characters. Characters were Christian or Mormon or Catholic or Scientologist as a social fact, as something that connected them to communities and traditions, and that shaped how they saw themselves and how others categorized them. Whether they actually believed specific theological claims with genuine conviction, or whether their behavior reflected religious values and teachings, seemed secondary to the identity itself, and to the social functions that identity served. The show's satire of religious institutions focused extensively on how organizations built around religious ideas could become more concerned with preserving their own power and influence than with serving their stated spiritual missions or living up to their founding principles. The Catholic Church hierarchy in _quote_63_ cared more about protecting the institution's reputation and maintaining its authority than about protecting children from abuse or holding abusive priests accountable for serious crimes. Scientology, in Trapped in the Closet, appeared as an organization designed primarily to extract money from members through an endless series of courses and materials, and to protect itself from criticism through legal intimidation and harassment of anyone who questioned or opposed it. Even smaller religious institutions and local churches appeared as bureaucracies more concerned with procedures, rules, and maintaining smooth operations than with helping people, pursuing truth, or transforming lives in meaningful ways. This institutional critique suggested that religious organizations, like all human organizations, tended to prioritize their own survival and growth over their founding purposes and stated ideals. The people running these institutions might start with genuine religious motivations and sincere beliefs about serving God and helping people. Yet the dynamics of organizational life, the pressures of maintaining institutions and managing resources, pulled them toward compromising principles, avoiding difficult truths that might threaten the organization, and protecting institutional interests even when doing so contradicted the religious values the institution claimed to represent. South Park portrayed this as a structural problem inherent in how organizations function, rather than just as individual moral failure by particularly corrupt leaders, suggesting that religious institutions almost inevitably betrayed their religious ideals to some degree simply by being institutions. Another consistent satirical theme was how religious certainty and dogmatism created conflict and prevented understanding between different groups who should have been able to find common ground. Episodes like Go God Go and Go God Go 12 showed that atheists could become just as dogmatic and intolerant as religious believers when they treated their atheism as absolute truth rather than as a position held with appropriate intellectual humility. Episodes bringing together different religions showed that each faith's certainty about its own correctness and its assumption that competing faiths were wrong made cooperation and mutual understanding difficult even when people genuinely wanted peace and had strong motivations to work together. The show suggested repeatedly that the problem was not believing specific religious claims or having religious faith in itself. Instead, the problem was how people held those beliefs and how they treated others who believed differently. Believing with absolute certainty that you were right and that everyone who disagreed was wrong, whether your certainty was about religious truth or about religious falseness, created the conditions for conflict, intolerance, and the dehumanization of people with different beliefs. This applied equally to religious believers absolutely certain about their faith, and to atheists absolutely certain about religion's falseness and irrationality. South Park also satirized how religious communities could become closed systems that rejected outside information and that interpreted everything through predetermined religious frameworks that could not be questioned or examined critically. Scientology's use of specialized vocabulary, interpretive systems, and progressive revelation that kept members isolated from critical perspectives and from information that contradicted Scientology's claims demonstrated this pattern clearly. Evangelical communities that dismissed scientific evidence conflicting with their literal interpretations of scripture, refusing to even seriously consider evidence that challenged their predetermined conclusions, showed similar patterns of closed thinking. The show portrayed these closed systems as limiting people's ability to think freely and critically, and as making communities vulnerable to manipulation by leaders who controlled information, interpretation, and access to outside perspectives. The treatment of religious texts and teachings revealed another important layer of satire. The show repeatedly portrayed people who claimed to follow sacred texts, yet seemed fundamentally unfamiliar with what those texts actually said or taught. Religious authorities would cite scripture or tradition to support positions that served their purposes, while conveniently ignoring textual passages that contradicted their arguments or that would require them to change their behavior. This selective reading and self-serving interpretation of religious sources appeared across different faiths and traditions, suggesting it was a universal human tendency rather than a problem specific to any particular religion. The show's satire of apocalyptic thinking and end times prophecy suggested that religious communities' focus on signs, portents, and the approaching end of the world could distract from present responsibilities and could make people vulnerable to manipulation by those who claimed special knowledge of divine plans. Episodes like __quote_67__ showed how hunger for prophetic fulfillment could lead people to see deep significance in random events and coincidences, and could create opportunities for pranksters or charlatans to exploit religious expectations and desires for certainty about the future. The critique of religious morality and moral reasoning appeared throughout South Park's religious content in various forms. The show portrayed religious moral frameworks as sometimes leading to absurd conclusions when applied rigidly, as being applied inconsistently depending on whose behavior was being judged, or as being used to justify cruelty and intolerance that contradicted the core ethical teachings of the religions themselves. Religious characters would claim moral authority and superior ethical understanding based on their faith, yet would make clearly immoral choices when those choices served their interests. They would condemn others harshly for relatively minor violations of religious rules, while ignoring their own serious moral failings. They would use religious language to dress up selfish or cruel behavior as righteous and divinely ordained, claiming God's approval for actions that served their personal or political interests. However, South Park's satire was not entirely negative toward religion or dismissive of its value in people's lives. The show also portrayed religion as serving genuine human needs and as providing real benefits to communities and individuals when practiced with sincerity, humility, and genuine concern for others. __quote_68__ showed a Mormon family whose faith made them genuinely happy, functional, loving, and kind in ways that were admirable, and that contrasted favorably with non-religious families. Episodes about religious holidays often showed how traditions and rituals brought families together, created meaning and connection across generations, and provided structure and significance to life's important moments. The show suggested that religion could be valuable and beneficial even if its specific theological claims were questionable or unprovable, as long as it helped people live better lives, treat each other well, and find meaning and purpose. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. This thematic layer of examining human behavior around belief leads naturally to understanding how South Park used religion as a mirror, reflecting broader cultural patterns and universal human tendencies. Section 11. Religion as mirror, not enemy. The most important thing to understand about South Park's treatment of religion is that the show does not primarily attack religion itself or aim to destroy religious faith. Instead, South Park uses religion as a mirror to examine human nature, human behavior, and human society. Religion serves as a particularly useful subject for this examination because it touches on fundamental questions about meaning, morality, community, and truth that every person and every society must grapple with in some way. By focusing on how people practice religion, how religious communities function, and how belief systems interact with other aspects of life, South Park reveals patterns and tendencies that extend far beyond religion into nearly every area of human existence. This mirror function becomes clear when you examine what South Park actually criticizes in its religious episodes across more than 2 decades. The show does not spend much time arguing that God does not exist or that religious beliefs are inherently foolish. Those questions about ultimate truth and divine existence appear occasionally in certain episodes, yet they are not the show's main concern or primary focus. Instead, the show focuses relentlessly on human behavior, human motivation, and human social dynamics as they play out in religious contexts. The hypocrisy, greed, tribalism, certainty, closed-mindedness, and institutional corruption that South Park identifies in religious settings are not problems unique to religion. They are human problems that appear everywhere humans create institutions, form communities, adopt belief systems, or claim authority over others. Consider the hypocrisy that appeared in so many South Park episodes about religion across different seasons and different faith traditions. When the show portrayed religious people saying one thing and doing another, claiming to believe certain values yet behaving in ways that contradicted those values, this was not fundamentally a critique of religion as such. It was a critique of human dishonesty and self-deception, universal human tendencies that religion simply made more visible and obvious. Religious contexts made the hypocrisy easier to identify because religion makes explicit moral claims about how people should behave, and because religious people often claim moral authority based on their beliefs. However, the same gap between stated values and actual behavior appears constantly in politics, where politicians campaign on principles they abandon upon taking office. In business, where companies make claims about ethical practices while exploiting workers. in education, where institutions claim to value learning while focusing on fundraising, and in every other area of human life where people make claims about what they believe. The people of South Park in quote 69, who became obsessed with avoiding technical sins while still treating each other badly, still gossiping and judging and being cruel in their daily interactions, demonstrated a human tendency to focus on rules and procedures rather than on underlying principles. This tendency appears everywhere you look in human society. People in workplaces focus on following policies exactly rather than actually serving customers well or producing good work. People in schools focus obsessively on grades and test scores rather than actual learning and understanding. People in government focus on procedures and regulations rather than solving real problems that affect people's lives. Religion simply provided South Park with a particularly clear context to examine this universal human tendency to substitute rule following for genuine moral effort, to care more about technical compliance than about actual goodness or improvement in how we treat each other. The commercialization of religion that appeared in episodes like Christian Rock Hard reflected broader patterns of how modern consumer capitalism absorbed and transformed everything it touched, turning even sacred traditions into products to be marketed and sold. Christian rock music as a commercial genre, where Cartman could succeed by making superficial changes to existing pop songs, was just one example of how market forces shaped cultural production. The same dynamics appeared in how environmental causes became marketing opportunities for corporations to sell products while appearing socially conscious, how social justice movements got co-opted by brands seeking to appeal to demographics, how every human concern and value eventually became attached to commercial transactions. South Park used Christian music to examine these dynamics in a specific context, yet the critique extended far beyond religion to the entire structure of modern commercial culture. The tribalism and identity politics that appeared consistently in South Park's treatment of religion reflected universal human tendencies toward in-group loyalty and out-group hostility. Kyle identifying as Jewish primarily as a social and cultural marker rather than as a theological commitment showed how people used labels to define themselves in relation to others, to claim membership in particular groups that provide belonging, and to distinguish themselves from people who were different. This same dynamic appeared powerfully in political affiliations, where people identified as Democrat or Republican often more as tribal identity than as genuine commitment to particular policies. It appeared in ethnic identities that shaped how people saw themselves and others, in regional loyalties where people identified with their home states or cities, in sports team fandom where people developed intense emotional connections to teams and hostility toward rivals, and in countless other contexts where humans divided themselves into competing groups. Religion made these dynamics visible and exaggerated because religious identity carried deep significance and connected to ultimate questions. Yet the underlying psychology was not specifically religious. The institutional problems that South Park identified in organizations like the Catholic Church or Scientology reflected general problems with how human institutions operated regardless of their stated purposes. Organizations prioritizing their own survival over their stated missions, leaders using positions for personal benefit rather than service, bureaucracies becoming focused on procedures rather than original purposes. These patterns appeared in corporations that abandoned stated values to maximize profits, in government agencies more concerned with protecting budgets than serving citizens, in schools caring more about rankings than education, in hospitals prioritizing financial sustainability over patient care. The Catholic Church protecting abusive priests to protect institutional reputation paralleled exactly how corporations protected criminal executives to avoid bad publicity, how police departments protected abusive officers to maintain public trust, how universities protected harassing professors to avoid scandal. South Park examined these dynamics in a religious context because religious institutions made the contradictions particularly stark between stated ideals of service and the reality of institutional self-interest. Yet the problems were institutional and human rather than specifically religious. The certainty and dogmatism that led to conflict in episodes like quote 71 and quote 72 reflected human cognitive biases and the psychological comfort of believing you were right and others were wrong. People displayed this same certainty in political arguments, where each side was absolutely convinced of its correctness, in debates about parenting styles or dietary choices, where people treated their approaches as obviously superior. In sports discussions, where fans were certain their team was best. In aesthetic preferences, where people could not accept that others might legitimately prefer different art or music. The atheists in the future who fought wars over trivial differences in terminology demonstrated that removing religion did not remove the human tendency towards certainty, tribalism, and violent conflict. These were human traits that would express themselves regardless of what specific beliefs people held. South Park's key insight that made the mirror function work was portraying religious people as regular people, flawed and contradictory like all humans, rather than as uniquely foolish or completely different from non-religious people. Religious believers in South Park episodes displayed the same selfishness, confusion, fear, hope, kindness, and cruelty as non-religious characters throughout the series. They made the same types of mistakes, fell into the same types of traps, struggled with the same types of questions about how to live and what mattered. Religion did not make them better or worse than other people in any fundamental way. It simply provided a context where certain human tendencies became more visible. Father Maxey in Red Hot Catholic Love exemplified this realistic portrayal. He was a priest who genuinely believed in Catholic Christianity and tried to live according to his faith. Yet he also struggled with doubt about his beliefs, became frustrated with church hierarchy and their refusal to address serious problems, and had to decide whether to follow institutional rules or his own conscience when those came into direct conflict. He was neither a saint who always did the right thing, nor a hypocrite who was secretly corrupt. He was a person trying to do what he thought was right while navigating complicated institutional realities. This realistic portrayal made him relatable to viewers and made the episode's critique of church hierarchy land more effectively. The Mormon family in __quote_7 represented another powerful example. The family members were genuinely kind, loving, and functional in their relationships. Their religion seemed to help them rather than harm them, providing structure and meaning that made their lives work better. They were not portrayed as stupid for believing things that seemed implausible to outsiders, nor as secretly evil underneath their pleasant exteriors. They were good people whose lives worked well, and their religion was clearly part of why. The episode critiqued Mormon origin stories mercilessly, with the repeated quote 75 refrain, yet it validated Mormon people and acknowledged that religious communities could produce genuinely positive outcomes. This willingness to show religion's positive aspects alongside its negative aspects, to portray religious people sympathetically while still critiquing religious institutions, demonstrated that South Park's target was not religion itself. The show examined how humans used religion, what functions religion served, where religion helped people, and where it hurt them. These examinations revealed truths about human nature and human society that extended far beyond religion. The show's treatment of different religions with similar satirical approaches also revealed the mirror function at work. South Park did not single out one religion as uniquely bad while treating others gently. Instead, the show found similar human patterns across Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Mormonism, and Scientology. Each religion had its own specific characteristics that shaped how these human patterns manifested. Yet the underlying human behaviors appeared consistently across different religious traditions. This consistency suggested that what South Park examined was human nature expressing itself through religion, rather than religion creating these problems. Episodes that brought different religions together, like Ginger Cow, particularly highlighted how South Park used religion as a mirror. When Jewish rabbis, Christian ministers, and Islamic clerics all responded to the same supposed prophetic sign involving the red cow, they revealed both shared human hopes for peace and shared human tendencies towards suspicion and fragile cooperation that could collapse under pressure. The religious differences between these leaders were real and significant, yet their human similarities were equally important. They all wanted recognition from their communities. They all sought certainty about ultimate questions. They all struggled with balancing ideals and practical realities. The religious context made these human characteristics visible, yet the characteristics themselves were universal. South Park's satirical method of exaggeration served the mirror function effectively. By taking real human tendencies and pushing them to extremes, the show made patterns visible that might be harder to see in realistic portrayals. When Cartman succeeded in Christian rock by simply changing love songs to be about Jesus instead of romantic partners, this exaggerated version made viewers think about less obvious ways that commercialization affected religious expression. When future atheists fought wars over trivial doctrinal differences, this absurd scenario made viewers recognize less extreme versions versions of the same tribalism in their own communities. The show's consistency in applying satirical scrutiny to all forms of certainty, dogmatism, and institutional power demonstrated that its target was these human tendencies wherever they appeared. South Park mocked not only religious certainty, but also atheist certainty, not only religious institutions, but also secular institutions, not only religious hypocrisy, but also secular hypocrisy. This even-handedness revealed that the show's perspective was fundamentally about examining human behavior, rather than promoting or opposing any particular belief system. Understanding South Park's religious satire as mirror rather than attack helps explain why the show could be simultaneously offensive to religious believers and popular with many religious people. The offense came from seeing sacred beliefs treated irreverently, from having revered figures presented in mocking ways. Yet the popularity among some religious viewers came from recognizing the truth in what the show portrayed, from seeing problems in religious communities that they also saw, from appreciating satire that held religious people accountable to their stated values. The mirror function also explains why South Park's religious satire remained relevant across decades. Human nature does not change rapidly. The tendencies toward hypocrisy, tribalism, certainty, and institutional corruption remained constant features of human existence. By focusing on these human patterns rather than specific theological debates, South Park created religious satire with lasting relevance. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The recognition that South Park used religion as a mirror to examine universal human patterns leads directly to the question of what lessons the show offers about belief, faith, and how humans should approach these fundamental questions. Section 12. What South Park teaches us about belief. After examining hundreds of South Park episodes dealing with religion across more than 25 years, certain lessons and perspectives emerge about belief, faith, and how humans should approach questions of meaning and truth. These lessons do not constitute a systematic philosophy or a coherent theological position. South Park was entertainment that used satire and comedy to examine religious topics, not a philosophical text offering definitive answers to life's big questions. However, the patterns in how the show treated religion, the consistency in what it criticized and what it validated, and the underlying values that appeared across many different episodes reveal a set of practical insights about belief and how to think about religion. The first and most fundamental lesson is about humility and uncertainty in how we hold our beliefs. South Park consistently criticized people who were absolutely certain they were right and everyone else was wrong, whether those people were religious believers convinced they knew God's truth, or atheists convinced they knew religion was false and irrational. The show suggested through both direct argument and through demonstrated consequences that certainty was dangerous regardless of what you were certain about. When people became convinced they possessed absolute truth, they stopped listening to others who might have valuable perspectives, stopped considering alternative viewpoints that might challenge their assumptions, and became willing to harm people who disagreed with them, because disagreement was no longer just honest difference of opinion. Instead, disagreement became error or evil that needed to be corrected or suppressed for the good of society. The future atheists in Go God Go and Go God Go 12, who fought wars despite all being committed to reason and science, demonstrated that certainty was the problem rather than any specific belief content. These characters all agreed that religion was false and that science and reason should guide human life. Yet they still divided into warring factions: the Unified Atheist League, the United Atheist Alliance, and the Allied Atheist Alliance, because they were certain their particular understanding of atheism and science was correct, and other versions were wrong and dangerous. The certainty about being right made cooperation impossible, even among people who agreed on fundamental questions about the non-existence of God and the importance of rationality. South Park suggested through many episodes that holding beliefs with appropriate humility, acknowledging that you might be wrong about things you feel certain about, remaining genuinely open to other perspectives rather than just pretending to listen, and treating disagreement as honest difference rather than as moral failure or stupidity, made for better individuals and better societies. This applied to religious believers who should acknowledge they might be wrong about theological claims they cannot prove, to atheists who should acknowledge the limits of what science can definitively prove about questions of ultimate meaning, to everyone who held strong convictions about controversial questions that reasonable people disagreed about. The Mormon boy Gary in All About Mormons exemplified this humble approach to belief. He acknowledged openly that his religion's origin stories about Joseph Smith and golden plates seemed implausible to people outside the faith. and that he could not prove his beliefs were objectively true. He did not claim absolute certainty or demand that others believe what he believed or treat Mormon claims as obviously correct. Yet he also defended his right to believe what he believed and pointed out clearly that his beliefs helped him and his family live good lives, create loving relationships, and find meaning and purpose. This combination of holding beliefs seriously enough to guide your life while acknowledging their unprovable nature represented an ideal that South Park validated through how the episode treated Gary and his family with respect despite mocking Mormon theology. A second major lesson involves the gap between beliefs and behavior, between what people claim to value and what they actually do. South Park demonstrated repeatedly across many different episodes and religious contexts that what people say they believe matters less than how they actually behave, particularly how they treat other people in their daily lives. Religious believers who claimed to follow teachings about love and compassion, yet treated others cruelly, were portrayed negatively as hypocrites. Atheists who claimed to value reason and evidence, yet behaved irrationally based on tribal loyalties or emotional reactions, were portrayed as equally hypocritical. What mattered was not the content of beliefs. Instead, what mattered was whether people lived according to their stated values and whether their beliefs made them better people. This insight cuts in multiple directions and creates obligations for everyone rather than just for religious believers. If you are religious and claim your faith makes you moral or good, then you have an obligation to actually be moral and good, to treat others well, to live according to your religion's ethical teachings about how to behave. If you fail to do this, if your behavior contradicts your stated beliefs, then your religious identity and theological beliefs mean nothing or make you a hypocrite whose words cannot be trusted. Similarly, if you are not religious and claim that secular ethics or reason make you moral or good, then you have the same obligation to actually live ethically and treat others well. Claiming superior moral understanding while behaving badly is equally hypocritical regardless of whether the claimed understanding comes from religion or from secular philosophy. Father Maxey's confrontation with Catholic Church hierarchy in _quote_80__ emphasized this priority of behavior over doctrine. Father Maxey did not question Catholic theology or argue about religious beliefs. He demanded that church leaders actually protect children and prioritize victims over institutional interests, to behave according to the values the church claimed to represent. The episode validated Father Maxey's position precisely because he was asking the church to live up to its own standards rather than attacking the church from outside based on different values. A third lesson concerns the value of questioning authority and thinking for yourself rather than accepting what leaders or institutions tell you simply because they claim religious authority or special knowledge. South Park portrayed religious authorities as human beings subject to the same flaws, biases, and corruptions as anyone else. Treating religious leaders as infallible or as automatically correct simply because of their positions led to people being exploited, controlled, and harmed by those who abused positions of trust. The show suggested that everyone, religious or not, had a responsibility to think critically about what they were told, to question claims even from sources they respected and trusted, and to use their own judgment about right and wrong rather than outsourcing moral thinking to authorities. This lesson appeared most clearly in Trapped in the Closet, where Scientology used claims about special knowledge and spiritual advancement to control members and extract money from them through an endless series of courses and materials. The episode portrayed people who questioned Scientology's claims as healthier and freer than people who accepted everything they were told. Stan's rejection of being the reincarnated Ron Hubbard, despite Scientology leaders insisting he was represented appropriate independence and critical thinking. The episode validated his refusal to accept what authorities claimed about him when those claims contradicted his own experience and judgment. However, South Park also showed that questioning authority and thinking for yourself required actual thought and genuine engagement rather than just reflexive rejection of anything traditional or institutional. Simple rebellion or automatic opposition to religion was portrayed as no better than blind acceptance and equally thoughtless. The show mocked both religious fundamentalists who accepted everything their leaders said without question, and atheist activists who dismissed all religion without genuine engagement with what religious people actually believed or valued. A fourth lesson involves recognizing the difference between religious beliefs and religious people, between critiquing ideas and attacking individuals or communities. South Park demonstrated that you could strongly disagree with religious claims, mock religious beliefs as implausible or irrational, and criticize religious institutions while still treating religious people with basic respect and acknowledging that religion served valuable functions for many people. The show could satirize Mormon origin stories mercilessly with the "dum dum 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 dum" refrain, while portraying a Mormon family as genuinely admirable. It could mock Catholic theology while showing priests as genuinely trying to do good and serve their communities. It could critique how people used religion while acknowledging that religion helped people find community, meaning, and purpose. This distinction mattered because it pointed toward a way of engaging with religious differences that did not require either complete agreement or complete rejection. You could think someone's beliefs were wrong or implausible while recognizing that those beliefs helped them live good lives and created positive outcomes. You could criticize serious problems in religious communities while acknowledging genuine benefits those communities provided to members. You could oppose religious influence in politics or public life while respecting individuals' rights to be religious in their private lives and to raise their children according to their beliefs. The broader culture wars around religion often failed to make these distinctions, treating any criticism of religion as attack on religious people themselves, or treating any religious belief as dangerous extremism that threatens society. South Park modeled a more nuanced approach, where critique and respect could coexist, where you could hold strong views while acknowledging complexity and while treating those who disagreed as worthy of consideration rather than as enemies to be defeated. A fifth lesson concerns the dangers of taking yourself or your beliefs too seriously, of losing perspective and becoming so invested in being right that you forget to be kind, reasonable, or self-aware. South Park's fundamental comedic method involved mocking everything and everyone, refusing to treat anything as so sacred that it could not be subject to humor and irreverence. This approach suggested that maintaining some distance from your own beliefs, being able to laugh at yourself and at ideas you held dear, served important psychological and social functions. People who could not tolerate their beliefs being questioned or mocked, who responded to criticism or satire with anger and threats of violence, revealed that their relationship with their beliefs had become unhealthy and that their certainty had made them rigid and intolerant. The ability to hear criticism, to engage with mockery without becoming violent or threatening, to maintain enough security in your beliefs that they could withstand scrutiny and humor, marked mature faith or mature conviction, whether religious or secular. The violent responses to depicting Muhammad demonstrated what happened when beliefs became so serious and so protected that any questioning or mockery was treated as unacceptable attack. This absoluteness, this refusal to permit any irreverence or criticism, created conditions for extremism and violence. South Park suggested through its own practice that nothing should be exempt from scrutiny, humor, and critical examination, and that protecting beliefs from criticism ultimately weakened those beliefs and the people who held them by making them fragile and defensive. A sixth lesson involves the importance of consequences and consistency in evaluating beliefs. South Park portrayed religious claims as worthy of serious engagement precisely because religion made claims about ultimate truth, about how people should live, about what mattered most in existence. These were important claims that deserved to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. Yet taking them seriously meant they should have consequences and should be held to consistent standards. If you claimed your religion was true and from God, then your religion should actually help you live better, should make you more moral, should provide real guidance. If religious people were no better or were even worse than non-religious people, then what did the religious claims actually mean? This applied equally to secular belief systems. If you claimed that science and reason were superior guides to human life than religion, then people guided primarily by science and reason should live better lives, should treat others better, should make wiser decisions than religious people. If this was not true in practice, then the claims of superiority were empty. South Park suggested that all belief systems, religious or secular, should be judged by their fruits, by what they actually produced in terms of human behavior, human societies, and human flourishing. Beliefs that led to good outcomes deserved respect even if their theological or philosophical claims seemed questionable. Beliefs that led to bad outcomes deserved criticism regardless of how lofty their stated ideals. Finally, South Park taught that the questions religion dealt with, questions about meaning, purpose, morality, death, suffering, and how to live were genuinely important questions that every person and every society had to answer somehow. Dismissing these questions as meaningless or treating them as already conclusively answered was portrayed as naive. Whether you were religious or not, you had to figure out how to make meaning, how to determine right from wrong, how to cope with suffering, how to build communities. Religion was one way people approached these questions, yet the questions themselves were universal. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These lessons about humility, consistency, critical thinking, and the genuine importance of belief form South Park's lasting contribution to how we think about religion in a pluralistic society where people approach fundamental questions in radically different ways. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.